Chapter 1. John felt the knot in his stomach tighten as he crossed the invisible line that marked the town's border. He eased up on the gas pedal and brought the Ford to an almost snail pace. He'd been dreading this moment, putting it off for weeks. Yet he knew, when he received the news of Mary's death, that he'd have to go back to the house. He'd thought of 101 reasons not to come back, but for all the reasons, he knew he would. He hadn't been in any rush, not until that jumped-up, young son of a bitch started throwing his weight around and decided to sack him. Well, he'd seen it coming for weeks now, so no job, no flat. So here he was, going back to Wales to claim his childhood home. Already the nightmares were rushing back. No matter how hard he tried to think of something else, they kept on rearing up, challenging him to deny them. He felt the sweat stand out on his forehead and quickly wound down the window, letting the cold air in to claim its prize. As he drove into town, he was surprised at just how little had changed. He'd been gone for over 20 years, but looking round the place, it was as though he'd never left. He'd kept in touch with Mary over the years, but he'd never been back to visit her. What with his job taking him here, there, and everywhere, well, he just hadn't been able to find the time. He felt a pang of guilt, and quickly told himself that he'd stop for food later. He thought about Mary. She'd had her own life. She didn't have to take him in. Maybe she thought that being his mother's sister meant it was her duty to give him a home after his parents' death. Well, he'd never know now. He couldn't remember much about his mother and father, and when he'd asked Mary, all she will say was that they had died in an accident, and that was that. As he pulled up outside the house, he was dismayed at the state of the place. He hadn't been expecting a palace, but the place looked almost derelict. The thought of driving off and finding a comfortable hotel dangled in front of him, but he brushed it aside. He knew that that would be just running away again. This time, like it or not, he was going to have to stand up to the nightmares. He looked up at the house and sighed. "That house is the perfect setting for any nightmares," he mumbled. No sooner had he opened the car door when there was an almighty crash, and all heaven opened up. He made a quick decision to leave his case in the car boot and made a dash for the front door. It was only a matter of a few yards, but by the time he reached the front porch, he was completely drenched. He fished out the key, stabbed at the lock, and after a few swift kicks to the bottom of the door, he finally got it open. That was when the smell hit him. He never carried a hanky chief, so he pulled his jumper up over his mouth and nose and dived for the nearest window. He slipped on something soft, but managed to keep his balance. Glancing down, he saw the remains of a half-eaten bird. He felt the bile rise in his throat and swallowed hard, cringing at the sour taste. He threw the two large windows open as wide as they would go. Not caring that the rain came pouring in, it might wash some of this crap away, he thought. As he looked around the room, he was suddenly aware of the whole carpet that seemed to be alive and wriggling. Only it wasn't the carpet. There must be at least 50 bloody cats in the room, and, judging by the sound coming from upstairs, he guessed that there was probably the same number up there. It took a couple of hours, and a few bites and scratches, but John managed to rid the house of all the cats, and the cat remains. He'd broke out into a sweat as the bloody cats kept leaping back through the windows. No sooner had he thrown them out, so he had had to close the windows and suffer the smell. He took a good look round the house, going from room to room. Every room he entered just seemed to get worse, and it was a right dump. It might have been decent once, but that must have been a long, long time ago. He guessed that most of the damage had been done by the cats, and judging from the mess, they must have taken up residence long before Mary died. Well, they won't be coming back in a hurry, he laughs. After he'd thrown them out, they had ganged up on the front lawn and made a god-awful din like a demented banshee. John had found an old hose pipe and gone charging out, screeching at the top of his voice and soaking every cat in sight. It was strange. They'd sat out in the pouring rain, not giving a damn, but the shore didn't like being soaked by the hose. Strange. John had once heard that if you threw water over a cat, then it wouldn't come back. He didn't know how true this was, so he would just have to wait and see. He hadn't noticed the twilight creeping in while he was busy with the cats, and back in the house the room had grown quite dark. But even so, it still didn't look or smell much better. Just as he switched the light on, there was a heavy knock on the door. Peering round the curtain, he saw the police car parked almost on top of his own car. He was in two minds to pretend that he wasn't in, but then he figured that the cop must have witnessed the light going on. Opening the door a crack, John looked at the fat police officer, taking him in head to toe. "Can I help you?" John inquired. "Well, sir, maybe you can. I was driving past when I saw the TA." "I know, and you thought the place was being burgled," John butted in. "Would you tell me who you are and what you are doing here?" the cop asked sharply. "I'm John Lowe, and, well, I guess I live here." The cop stared at him hard. "Shit," John thought. "I've got off to a great start here." Suddenly, the cop's face softened, and a broad smile spread across his lips. "Hell, I remember you now, you're Jenny's boy." John was startled. He hadn't heard his mother's name in a long time. He studied the man in front of him, and suddenly realized that a face from the past was smiling back at him from behind the old sagging flesh and mop of gray hair, but he just couldn't recall the name. The cop seemed to read his mind. "You wouldn't remember me. I'm Sergeant Jones. Well, back then I was just okay. I visited Mary a lot, and I guess I kind of watched you grow up." As the man talked, the memories came rushing back. The picnics, the days by the seaside, the fish and chips. The smell filled his mind. Hell, okay, Jones. Imagine not remembering him. Still, the years had taken their toll, and the name, well, it wasn't surprising he'd forgotten it. John shot out his hand and shook the old man's fleshy fingers warmly. "I'm sorry I err. Hey, it's good to see you. Please come in," he spluttered, the words falling over each other. "I'm in a bit of a rush now, but I'll see you soon, real soon." John watched as Sergeant Jones drove off. Strange, he thought, old. Jones had made a hasty exit. Maybe he'd felt a little awkward after all these years. He knew that he did. He returned to the front room and dropped heavily into the old armchair. Glancing round the dirty room, he was glad the officer hadn't taken up his invitation. Shit. He really would have to do some decorating. He was surprised at how easily he'd accepted the idea of living in the house again. After all, it was only an hour or so ago that he'd dreaded the thought of even entering the place, and had been ready to run off to the nearest motel room. He wondered just what it was that he'd been so scared of. He could remember the nightmares he'd had after his parents' deaths, but hell, they were only nightmares. And after all, he was only 9 years old at the time. What could he expect? He ignored the fact that the nightmares had tormented him until he turned 18, and how he couldn't wait to leave the house, and that his first night away from the place was the first decent night's sleep he'd had. He'd had no dreams, as far as he knew, that night. He'd always been a weak and scrawny kid, but as soon as he'd left home, He'd begun to grow stronger and bigger. It was as though a heavy weight he'd been carrying had been taken from him, and he could stretch and stand tall without being obstructed. He'd often thought of coming back and showing those school bullies a thing or two. But no matter how big and strong he'd become, he knew that he wouldn't be returning. That was until now. He yawned and glanced at his watch. 9 o'clock. How long had he been sitting there? He'd been driving all day, and he realized now just how tired he really was. Maybe the place won't look so bad after a good night's rest, he lied to himself. He knew that if he didn't make a move now, he'd end up spending the night on the armchair, and that prospect didn't much appeal to him. He was woken by the sound of somebody being murdered. At least, that was what it sounded like to him. Rubbing sleep from his eyes, he pounded over to the window. The rain had stopped, and the night sky was quite clear. John could make out at least 10 cats sitting on the front lawn in a circle, heads to the heavens, and wailing for all they were worth. Well, the hose job had worked on most of them, he thought. He grabbed his boot up off the floor and slung it at the little feline Stonehenge, regretting his actions at once. It had always looked good on the cartoons, but he'd only had the one pair of boots with him, as he'd left all the stuff in the car. He was in half a mind to leave it out there until the morning and get right back into bed. But knowing his bloody luck, the rain would come back down twice as hard as earlier on. He pulled on his jeans and cursed as another button came off his well-worn denim shirt. He'd had it for years now, but still thought he looked good in it. Barefooted, he made his way down the cold stairs. Before retrieving the boot, he lumbered into the front room and stole a glance at the dusty grandfather clock that stood to attention by the old black and white television set. It was only 4:30. A fleeting thought crept into his head. Either the clock was electric, or somebody must have been here recently to wind the thing up. And seeing as though he'd had to switch the electric on when he'd arrived, it only left the latter. He was still half asleep, so he let the thought creep out again. He'd give it a bit more thought in the morning, if he remembered. Outside, as he stooped to pick up his boot, he had a feeling of being watched. He swung round quickly to find a very large black cat staring at him. Apparently this one didn't scare so easily. "Get out of here, you mangy git," he hissed. Nothing. It didn't move a bloody inch. After a few more hisses and curses, and other useless efforts to get rid of the cat, John gave up and hurried back inside. The cold November night had chilled deep into his bones. He switched on the tatty 2-bar electric heater, relieved when he saw the orange glow appear, and sat almost on top of it, soaking up its welcoming warmth. When John opened his eyes again, it was almost 9. The fire was still going strong, and he could feel the sticky sweat gripping his cloths, making them cling to his body. He sniffed and wrinkled his nose at the pungent odor. A shower was in order. The shower wasn't a modern affair, just a rubber hose connected to the bath taps, and although he hadn't left the water long enough to heat up, he still felt refreshed and a whole lot better. The cat incident almost forgotten. Slipping on his coat, he went out into the cool morning air. He took a couple of large gulps. Hell, it really did taste different from the city air. He looked up at the sky. Apart from a couple of small black clouds, it was clear and didn't look like much chance of rain. He strolled over to the car and pulled his case from the boot. Maybe a change of cloths wouldn't go amiss. A movement from across the 7 narrow lane caught his attention. In the hedge sat the black cat, crouched down low and staring straight at him. John slowly made his way towards it. the cat wasn't in the least bit scared of him. When he was about 2 yards away, the cat got up, stretched, and vanished into the undergrowth. John turned away, but then turned quickly back. In the overgrown hedge, he could see a gate. He couldn't remember a gate ever being there, but that didn't mean there never was one. It could have been put there after he'd left. He pulled and tugged at the brown branches until he could see over the gate into the field beyond. There was a mist swirling about 3 feet over the entire field. Strange. He hadn't noticed a mist anywhere else. As he stared into it, dark shapes started to form and then dance across the field towards him. He pulled his head back sharply, blinked rapidly. The shapes disappeared. So did the mist, completely. No sign of it ever being there. John shuddered and walked quickly back to the house. He went into the kitchen and searched, but wasn't surprised when he found nothing in the way of food, not even a rusty old tin of beans. He thought about giving breakfast a miss, but his belly woke up and argued. His belly won hands down. He'd have to drive into town and buy a few things. As he drove through the town, he checked the sidewalks, not only for a place to eat, he also scrutinized the faces of the passers-by for any long-lost childhood friends. Hell, who was he kidding? As if he'd remember anyone after 20 years. And who'd remember him after 20 years? Sergeant Jones hadn't. Well, at least, not the face. Only the name. Funny, he thought. He never had known Jones's first name. When he was a kid, you was always expected to call the adults Mr. This or Mrs. That, yet they could go right ahead and call you by your first name. Even when he'd reached his teens, P.C. Jones was always P.C. Jones. He spied a small cafe, pulled up a side street, and parked the car, making sure there wasn't any double yellow lines. He ordered a complete fry up and a black coffee, and fell into a seat by the window to wait. He looked round the room. There were only 2 other customers. 2 very large blokes. Lorry drivers? Maybe a sign of good food, after all, John thought. It was only a small town, not a route for heavy traffic. So why else would lorry drivers leave their route to come here, if they were lorry drivers? Must be good food, he decided, and the rumble from his belly reminded him just how hungry he was. The sound of footsteps woke him from his thoughts, and he looked up and smiled at the steaming plate coming his way. The food was good, and after paying his bill, he strolled back to the car contented. He reached into his pocket for the keys, the thought, what the hell? I've nothing better to do, and I might as well take a look around the place. A few of the shops had changed, but some, like the ironmongers, were just as he remembered them. As a kid, he recalled, he bought the pellets for his airgun from the ironmongers. Oh, Mr. Wilkes ran the place he remembered, surprised that the name had sprung so easily to mind. He stepped into the shop, and his heart sank. It might look the same from the outside, but it was a lot different inside. A spotty-faced youth looked up as he entered and asked if he could help him. From the tone of his voice, he hoped it wouldn't be necessary. John didn't upset him and left. He'd only been in the shop for a couple of minutes at most, but in that time, the heavens had opened up once more. That was one thing he remembered about Buckley. It always seemed to rain. He pulled his collar up and dashed out into the street. He was soaked through in no time, so he gave up running and slowly walked back to the car. By the time he got back to the house, he was shivering uncontrollably. The car heater had done nothing to take away the chill. He changed into dry cloths and turned on the old TV set. It seemed to take forever to warm up, but as the screen cleared, he saw that a Carry On film was just starting. He could do with a hot drink inside to chase away the chill, but decided that he'd wait for the break in the film before he made one. Although he'd seen the picture 100 times before, he still didn't want to miss any of it. Sid James played a really good part in this farce about a highwayman. John had to wait for the end of the film before he had a chance to make his drink. When he'd switched the set on, he hadn't noticed that it was showing on BBC. Not that he minded. He always thought that the breaks spoiled films, and they were showing a double bill, so he had just enough time to get the drink and settle down before the next one started as the credits rolled by. While he was waiting for the endless credits to finish, John glanced out the window. It was as though someone had painted them a matte black when he wasn't looking. The night sky had reached down and put an end to another day. As he switched the light on, a slight sound from the window caught his attention. He turned, and his breath caught for an instant. There were two green eyes peering in. It took him a moment to realize what they were. The bloody cat was back. John pulled the curtains tightly shut. He had no intentions of playing games with it tonight. After watching a couple of hours of really crap game shows, he'd had enough. He got out of the chair and switched the television set off, deciding that an early night was in order. Although he hadn't really done anything all day, he was still out like a light as soon as his head hit the pillow. He was in the field. The mist was rolling round everywhere, but he didn't feel the cold. A strange moaning sound seemed to be coming from every direction. As John watched, the mist grew dark shapes, and these shapes took on the form of people, and these human forms were closing in on him. He felt the sweat drip from his brow as they drew in closer. He wanted to run, but his legs weren't having any of it. He was rooted to the spot. All he could do was swing from the hip and watch as they came closer. The nearest form emerged from the mist directly in front of him, and John could see his features. At least he thought it was a he. The creature had a skull with hair hanging in tatters, and matted in these tatters was wet grass and earth. It looked as though it had just dug itself out of its own grave. It stopped just in front of John and stared at him through eyeless sockets. He had no eyeballs, but John was still drawn to them. As he stared, he realized that there was something moving around inside the empty cavities. Then hundreds of worms fell out like they were being put through one of those old mincing machines. John tore his gaze away and swung round to be confronted by more of the zombies. Each one he looked at seemed to be worse than the last. As he watched in horror, they raised their arms and moved in on him. He let out a scream, but no sound left his lips. He tried again, nothing. Then they were on him, wet, stumpy fingers clawing at his flesh. He tried to fight them off, but was revolted just by the feel of them. Then he noticed it. He hadn't noticed it before, but the smell was unbelievable. It was so bad it seemed to be burning the back of his throat. John felt the bile rise. He clasped his mouth firmly shut, but he could still feel it rising. Suddenly, a zombie appeared so close, it was as though it was trying to kiss him. This was all too much for John, and he could no longer hold back, and the vomit came gushing forth. The creature howled as it was hit full force in the face, and then it was gone. Chapter 2. He shot upright. Beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. He quickly glanced round the room, taking in every detail. In the dark, he could just make out the outline of the old oak wardrobe standing alone in the corner. In the opposite corner, there was a small desk and chair, and these, together with the single bed, was the complete contents of the room. John had considered sleeping in Mary's room, but it had felt right to use his room, or what had once been his room. He wiped the sweat off his brow with the back of his hand and slumped back down into the pillow. His heartbeat slowed back down to a normal pace, and he drew in deep breaths to try and calm the pounding inside his skull. The field. It came rushing back. It had seemed so real. His skin started to crawl as he recalled the touch of those things as they tried to get a hold of him. He shuddered, relieved, slightly, that it was only a dream, just a dream. But it wasn't just a dream. It was their dream. He remembered it from his childhood. It hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was he, and he'd aged. But the dream was the same. Suddenly, his hand touched something wet and sticky. He drew it away quickly, so it wasn't all a dream. He threw back the puke-covered sheets and sighed. They had smelled of damp and decay before, and he could live with that, but not with the sickly smell as well. He'd spent 2 nights in the house, so why had the nightmares come last night, and not the night before? John answered his own question, because you had spent the night before sleeping in the chair. Could it be that easy? No, of course it couldn't. It was just that he had been so much more tired the previous night. Today, he resolved, he would do something more useful than just sit round watching telly. But what? Try and find a job for a starter. He couldn't live forever on what Mary had left him, or the small payoff he'd had from his last employment. He was willing to try any kind of work, but what he really wanted was another job as a private detective. He was good at that, really good. He didn't always play fair. Then again, who did? He recalled the look on that young, snotty-nosed brat. Ever since he had taken over the firm after his father's death, John had known his days were numbered. And if he thought about it, being sacked was really a blessing. He didn't like John, and John couldn't stand being in the same room as him. John smiled inwardly. The kid had really freaked. He'd called John into the office, and before the door had a chance to close, the kid had torn right into him. John couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. He'd been following this guy for weeks, and although he knew he was having an affair, the fellow was too smart to be caught out, so all he had done was hire a call girl to set the guy up for Christ's sake. Where was the harm in that? So what if she wasn't the woman the bloke had been having it off with? The wife wasn't to know. She had hired him to find out if her husband was having an affair, and he had found out and given her proof like she had wanted. Yay, she wasn't the woman he had been seeing, but he never turned his nose up at the call girl. So in his book, he was just as guilty doing it with her. How the hell was he to know the bloody guy would come clean and even take the woman to meet his wife? He was supposed to deny everything, not bloody confess. And the guy was smart, yay, too smart. And it didn't take him long to realize that the only way John could have got the pictures was by setting him up in the first place. So into the office they came to complain. And what do you know? The boss's son just happened to be acquainted with the couple personally. And although he did not admit as much, he knew the call girl just as personally. So that was that. The jerk had said that out of respect for his father, on account that he had liked John. He wouldn't just sack him. But there was no way he was going to let him stay. So John had been bought off. And cheap. A couple of grand for 17 years bleeding service. He had had to contain himself from telling him what he could do with it. But he knew if he had, the creep would do it, and he would end up with bloody nothing. John knew that the job center would be a waste of time after all. Which had ever seen adverts in an employment office for a private detective? He'd seen adverts in some daily tabloids, telling you how you can make a living as a private eye, and they make it sound oh so exciting. But the catch, and the least exciting part, is the amount of money you have to outlay in the beginning. He had often thought about setting up on his own. After all, he knew the game inside out, but he never had the nerve to make the move. Maybe now was the time to make that move. After all, what had he to lose? Right, that's it. That's what I'll do, he confided to his reflection in the bathroom mirror. I'll go into town and see if there's any office space to rent. He was pleased with this notion, and felt a lot better now he had a purpose. It would leave a large hole in his savings. But hell, what else was money for? He splashed the icy water onto his face and felt the chill charge and chases the cobwebs away. He cleaned his teeth and threw on a clean set of cloths. He was starting to feel good. Deep down, him knew that this time he would beat the nightmares. But at the same time, he had a bad feeling that there was more to the nightmares than them being just bad dreams. And although he was sure he was going to win, he just couldn't shake the bad feeling, and this scared the shit out of him. Oh well, back to the matter in hand, he grinned. The trip to the estate agent proved quite worthwhile. He had seen a couple of places that would suit him, and they were both in good locations. He called in at the local paper's office and placed an advert offering his services, and he'd have to wait to see what kind of response he got before deciding if it would be worth his while getting an office, or if it would be best to work from home. After placing the ad, he paid a visit to the supermarket and bought enough food to feed an army. He may as well eat well if he was going to stay. He also bought a duvet and a couple of pillows. He had decided the old sheets just were not worth washing. And a duvet made making the bed in the morning a whole lot easier. He made himself a chicken dinner, which was soon demolished, and settled down in the old armchair, book in one hand, a glass of wine in the other. He was about to pour his fourth glass when a scratching sound from the window caught his attention. Drawing back the curtain, he saw the black cat perched on the ledge, clawing at the glass pane. John opened the window slightly and went back over to the armchair, watching the cat to see what it would do next, smiling foolishly so as not to scare it. The animal stared at John through its slanted green eyes before it. At least it seemed to John, scowled, frowned as if in puzzlement, and then slowly made its way into the room. Watching John all the time, it stalked over to the other chair, jumped up, and nestled into the cushion. John finished off the last drop of wine, and then got somewhat unsteadily to his feet. Drink had never really agreed with him, but it didn't stop him from trying to persuade it. He was having quite a job keeping his eyes open, and he almost had to crawl up the stairs. It was debatable on whether he was asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow, or if he had fallen asleep before he nose-dived onto the bed. He was in the field again. This time the figures appeared a lot quicker, and before he knew it, he was surrounded by the zombies. He twirled round, desperately looking for some way out. But there was no way out. Soon B became dizzy and sank to his knees. This was the signal for the monsters to move in. He cringed as he felt their clammy hands clawing at his body. This is it, he thought. I'm going to be ripped to pieces and eaten alive. But they didn't rip him to pieces or eat him alive. He had always woken up at this stage of the nightmare in the past, and he tried desperately to wake himself now. But he wouldn't wake, and this time it didn't feel like a dream. This time he felt as though it might really be happening. He could feel the hot sting of the zombie's putrid breath against his cheek. He waited for the rotten teeth to bite into his flesh, but it didn't bite. Instead, It seemed as if it was talking to him, at least trying to talk. He screwed his eyes shut to block out the images, but he could not block out the voices that were coming from all around him. He couldn't bring himself to open his eyes and look at the pitiful creatures, even though their voices sounded as though they were pleading for his help. Help them! Help them how? He had no idea what kind of help they were after, nor, for that matter, did he want to know. He just wanted to be out of there. He wanted to be as far away from those things as possible, and as far away as possible from their horrible smell of death. He tried to close his ears to their death-rattling pleas, but the voices seemed to be coming from inside his head now, and there was no way of escaping them. Go away, leave me alone, he cried through clenched teeth. But the voices still came. The begging turned into frenzy. John felt as though his head was about to explode, and when he felt the wet sandpaper-like tongue on his face, he could take it no longer. He grabbed the zombie and opened his eyes to confront it. He found himself face to face with his startled visitor. The cat hissed and clawed at his hands. John squealed and dropped the cat, well almost threw the angry Moggy to the floor. It flew out of the door without a backward glance. John was about to go after it, but took one look at his injured hand and thought, to hell with it, after the entire bloody cat had scared him more than he had scared the cat. He got out of bed and staggered, still half asleep, to the bathroom to clean out the wound, noting the rays of sunlight invading the room through the slight gap in the curtains. After making himself a strong mug of coffee, he sank into the chair in the front room and tried to think. The dream. What did it mean? Perhaps nothing? No, it meant something. But what? He remembered the rotting faces. He had always been afraid of those faces, and it had taken years for him to forget them. And even now, after all these years, he still couldn't bring himself to watch a zombie film, however daft that might be. But last night had been different. Last night, instead of being frightening, they had seemed pitiful. He had even felt sorry for them, kind of. They had asked for help, but what kind of help could he possibly give? He suddenly felt stupid. He was beginning to think of his nightmares as real, and that he was actually in that field last night. A knock on the door brought him back down to earth. He opened the door to be greeted by the smiling Sergeant Jones. "Hello, John. I've not called at a bad time, have I?" "Just the opposite," John said warmly, gesturing him in. "Well, I've got the day off, and, I was wondering if you still like to fish." There was a pleading look in Sergeant Jones's eyes. Fishing? He hadn't been fishing for years, John realized, and then sighed. "But I haven't got a rod or anything." "That's okay. I've got two," the policeman chirped, the pleading look even more evident. "Well, in that case, what are we waiting for?" John grinned. It was the best day John Lowe had had in a long time. He hadn't been fishing since he was a kid, but the memories came flooding back, and he remembered how he had always got excited whenever he went. It was another of those childhood memories he'd abandoned when he finally left Buckley. And after all these years, he'd been allowed to call the sergeant by his Christian name, Roy. John had never thought of him as a Roy. Although, what a Roy was supposed to look like, he wasn't really sure. He realized that he had always thought of a Roy resembling Roy of the Rovers, or Roy Rogers, or even that goody two-shoes, Roy Lardy from way back in his school days. It was funny how that Roy had sprung to mind after all these years. God, he'd hated that kid. During the day, John had confided in the rugged policeman about his plans to start his own detective business. He had dropped it into the conversation in a light-hearted manner, not sure what reaction he would receive. but needing some sort of springboard. The old man thought it wasn't a bad idea, which had surprised John, but at the same time wasn't sure if there would be much call for his services in a place like Buckley. But he had also said that he would help him in any way he could, within reason, which really pleased John. Having someone on the inside, so to speak, could be a great boost. Old Roy was a bit disappointed when he learned that John hadn't got into the private eye game by being an ex-copper. But he cheered up a little when he found out he was ex-army. Well, it was the next best thing. John hadn't the heart to tell him that he had only done his basic training and then got out as quick as he could. They had stopped off on the way home for a bite to eat and a couple of pints, and before he knew it, it was getting on for 10 o'clock before John arrived home. He was surprised to see the cat stretched out on the settee. After last night, he thought that he had seen the last of it. As he reached out to stroke it, the cat hissed out a warning. "Oh, I see. I'm good enough to give you a roof over your head, but not good enough to stroke you," John said, faking hurt. The cat settled back, watching him through its one open eye. "Well, if you're going to be like that, I'm off to bed. Good night." John smiled at the motionless cat bowing and made a gallant exit. The nightmares came again that night. He tried to block them out, but they probed at his mind, sending flashes through his temples as though he was being prodded with a red-hot poker. He came awake and had to pry his eyes open with his fingers. They felt as though the eyelids had been glued together. The room was still in darkness. He felt something climbing up his leg. He slowly reached for the old light cord above his head and tugged on it. The whole room was suddenly bathed in a soft yellow glow. And crawling up his leg was the black cat. Something in the cat's eyes made John think of death, and he shuddered. Looking into those eyes was like looking into hell itself. The cat dropped off the bed and went over to the door. It turned, looked at John, and then drew itself to its full height and let out a deep, guttural moan. The moaning got louder and louder until John could take it no more. He scanned the floor in the yellow gloom for something to throw at it, but could see nothing at hand. He jumped out of bed and moved towards the moaning beast. As soon as the cat saw John jump out of bed, the noise stopped. John glared at it for a moment, and then shook his head and climbed back into the warm bed, and at that very same moment, the moaning started up again. "Right!" John yelled, throwing himself out of bed once more. The cat stopped as John's feet touched the floor and took a few paces back. As John advanced towards the cat would move away, leaving the same distance between them each time. John had the feeling the cat wanted him to follow it. Was he crazy? He wondered. A dog would act this way maybe, but a cat? All the same, he felt that that was what the cat wanted. He pulled on his jeans and sweatshirt and started to follow the animal. Downstairs, he leaned over and opened the front door, and the cat darted out into the night air. John thought that the entire animal wanted was to be let out, but the cat stopped by the gate and waited. John slipped his old trainers on and obliged the beast. He was suddenly aware of the bite of November's teeth. He cursed himself for not having grabbed a coat as well. He looked for the cat and saw it on the opposite side of the road now. John's heart missed a beat when he realized just where the animal had stopped. The gate looked like a giant mouth about to swallow the cat. As John hesitated, the damn thing started its moaning again. All right, I'm coming," he mumbled, hugging himself against the icy breeze. As soon as he got within inches of the cat, it disappeared under the gate. "I've just about had enough of this," he grumbled, turning back towards the house. But before he could move, a deathly scream broke the night. At first, John thought the animal had been hurt in some way, but then he reflected that no cat could make that kind of sound, no matter how much pain it was in. He found himself turning, his foot seeking out the bottom beam of the gate. They seemed to have taken on a life of their own, because there was no way he wanted to go over that gate. The climb to the top of the gate took a lifetime. He felt as though time had stopped still. There was no sound, and the night breeze had completely gone. He felt as though he was the only thing left alive on planet Earth. While he slept, the planet must have been invaded by hostile green men, and he was the only one they had missed. He was now balanced on the top beam of the gate. He didn't want to go over, but he knew that he couldn't turn back. As he stared across the field, he could see the familiar mist rolling in to meet him. But this time, in the center of the mist, there was a red light that seemed to swell and then explode into 1,000 tiny red glows. As John watched the red lights, they changed into yellow and then green and finally black. He didn't know how one could have a black light, but by God he was looking at them. Thousands of them. Maybe it wasn't God, he mused, and was surprised that the thought didn't really scare him. He felt his head begin to get light and started to sway. He looked down to his feet, but could see nothing. Nothing but the mists with its black lights beneath him. He didn't so much jump as feel that he had been pushed. In any case, down he went, and down, down and down. He knew it was only a matter of 4 feet to the ground, so why hadn't he landed yet? As he fell, he felt icy fingers clawing at his flesh. He heard curses and smelt the foul breath of his tormentors. He was pushed and beaten until he felt himself break away, and an icy breeze wiped the foul smell from his body. And then he hit the floor. As he lay there, he could hear footsteps coming towards him. He opened his eyes and looked up at a young girl. She smiled at him, and as she opened her mouth, earth and rotting teeth fell onto John's face. He was grateful to the darkness that rushed in to claim him. Chapter 3. John opened his eyes slowly. He expected to see the flaking paintwork and the grubby wallpaper of his bedroom, but instead he saw clouds drifting overhead and smelt the damp earth beneath him. The dream, the field again. It was only a dream. So what was he doing in the bloody field at... He looked at his watch, at bloody 10 to 5 in the bloody morning. Strange, he thought. He couldn't remember putting his watch on. He always took it off when he went to bed. He had been to bed, hadn't he? Just when he thought he was getting a hold on the dream, he was now sleepwalking. Jesus, whatever next? He rolled onto his side, and for the first time since he had awakened, he felt cold. But not only was he cold, but he was completely soaked too. It must have rained in the night, so if it had rained, how in the hell had it failed to disturb him? After all, he always thought of himself as a light sleeper. He rose somewhat unsteadily to his feet. He felt as though he'd been on a week's drunken spree. He had only had a couple, though, and they were with food. So he certainly hadn't been intoxicated last night. So why had he just taken up sleepwalking as a pastime? A sneering voice in his head said, "If you did sleepwalk..." "Of course I bloody sleepwalked," he retorted, annoyed. He shook his head. What the hell was he doing standing, or lying in the middle of a wet field at nearly 5 in the morning? He scolded himself. As he swayed towards the gate, the heavens opened up, throwing everything it had at John. This made him get his act together. Taking the gate in one leap, he bounded to the house, trying his best to dodge the tennis ball-sized water bombs. Once indoors, he stripped off his clothes. grabbed a blanket, switched the electric fire on, and sat shivering in the old armchair, trying to gather his thoughts. A picture slowly emerged. He could remember following that damn cat to the field. Was it a dream, or was it real? If it was a dream, then what was he doing in the field? And if it was real, well, was everything he saw real? And what the hell did it all mean? And why was it all happening now? He had all these questions, but no bloody answers. The thought of just getting the hell out of this place kept springing to mind, but he couldn't be sure the dreams wouldn't follow him. They hadn't followed him last time he'd left, but that was many years ago. Besides, he'd never awakened in the field then. His mind drifted back to his childhood. He had had some happy times in this house. He tried to recall his parents. He could get some sort of an image of his mother, but when attempted to form a picture of his father, all he could get was a very well-built body with a cloud of mist for a face. No matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't penetrate that veil that obscured his father's head. He remembered the fights too. Sometimes they were very violent. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. He shuddered and pulled the blanket tighter. They had thought he was asleep, but he lay in bed listening, too scared to move in case he made a noise, and them, well, not they. His dad had heard him and come up and start hitting him. The beatings he had taken from his father when he had come home drunk had left scars, mental scars. Scars that for the past 20 years he had put behind him. Was it by coming back that he had reopened the old wounds? Was this his real nightmare? He tried to remember when the nightmares had first come. He couldn't be sure about the exact time, but he knew it wasn't long after his parents' deaths. He recalled that, at the time, everyone had thought it was strange that he had shown no emotion when hearing of his parents' accident. But after all, he was only 9, and people did show their emotions in different ways. But John realized, with a chill, that he hadn't felt any sorrow, only relief. A selfish relief. Although he had had some good times, the bad times outnumbered them at 100 to 1. It wasn't his mother's fault. She had tried to be loving, but he never forgave her for not sticking up for him when his father beat him black and blue. All she did was stand in a corner and cry. She bloody cried. How the bloody hell did she think he felt? Sometimes he was so badly bruised that he couldn't go to school, and he had loved school. It was an escape. Oh, he had his fair share of being bullied at school, but no matter how much the kids bullied him, they couldn't compare with his father. He was a real expert. He felt a tear well up and swell until it burst and went rolling down his cheek. It hung onto his chin for a moment before falling off. John sniffed, but it was no good. The floodgates had opened and the tears came in their thousands. He didn't try to stop them now. It felt right. He hadn't wept in a long, long time. In fact, if he was honest, he wouldn't be able to say when he had wept last. His heart had been turned to stone at an early age, and over the years it hadn't melted one bit. Not until now, that is. And now that it had finally melted, he didn't want to try and stop it. John slowly eased himself out of the chair and headed for the stairs. Staggering into the bathroom, he steadied himself against the sink and stared into the mirror. The face glaring back at him looked familiar, but he just couldn't place it. He looked every bit of his 38 years. The beatings as a child and the beatings he had suffered in the course of his job had taken their toll. On the whole, he looked a lot like an ex-boxer. In all the films he had seen, private eyes were always tough. But in real life, it just wasn't the case, and he was living proof of that. He stared into the hard blue eyes. He didn't like what he saw behind those eyes, what he had become. His gaze dropped to his lopsided nose. A smile curved on his lips as he remembered how he had broken it. The lady had a real good left hook, and even now he could still laugh at the memory. She had been mad enough to kill him. He was only doing his job. And, as he had pointed out, it wasn't him having the affair. Her husband had the right to know. After all, he had always suspected she only married him for his money, and he had been proved right. She was having an affair with the man she had introduced as her brother. This had been the type of case you found in the movies, and he would always wear the scar to remember it by. His hair was in tatters and in great need of a stiff brush. He kept meaning to get it cut, but always managed to put it off. When it got too untidy, he would just tie it in a ponytail. But he hadn't bothered lately, as it had become fashionable for trendy well-to-dos to wear their hair in ponytails. And if one thing could be said about him, that was he was no trendy. He flexed his muscles and tried to eject the cold that had found its way deep into his bones. He was now aching in places he didn't know he could. He leaned over and turned the bath taps on. The welcoming steam that rose from the tub was comforting. He watched as the steam slowly covered the mirror, veiling the stranger's face. He took his finger and drew a smile where his mouth was. But even that smile was crooked. He sighed and turned away. He lay back and let the bath water lap over him. He closed his eyes as the warmth surged through his body. Once more his mind drifted back to his childhood. He could remember creeping out of his room when the arguments got really bad. He recalled seeing his father covered in blood and his mother yelling and cursing him. So if she was mad with him and not upset, then he knew the blood couldn't belong to his father, and there were no marks on his mother, so he knew that it wasn't her blood either. John remembered how he had lain awake all night wondering whose blood it could be. It was a haunting image that had stayed with him a long time. This beast of a man, his father, covered from head to foot in someone else's blood. A sudden realization hit him. It was the following day that his parents had the accident. The memories were becoming clearer. He had been disturbed by the shouting coming from downstairs. He went out onto the landing and could hear their quarreling. His father had hit the bottle early that morning and was already drunk. Suddenly the bickering had stopped, and he could hear his mother talking all sweet to his father. This had really confused him. What had happened to bring on the sudden change? She purred that she would like a drive out into the country so they could sort things out. His father had let out some sort of animal laugh and rushed out to the car with no thought for him whatsoever. They never came up to tell him where they were going. They just went. And that was the last time he saw them alive. He had waited on the landing for hours. He had expected his mother to come up and tell him his dinner was ready. But she wasn't going to be making dinner that day, nor any other day. The door had burst open, and he had got ready to rush down to greet his mother. But it wasn't his mother who came in. It was Mary, his aunt, and with her stood a grim-faced policeman. He had felt a lead weight grow in his chest. He didn't need them to say anything, and he knew what had happened. He had expected to be sent away. He knew it wouldn't be allowed to live in the house on his own. But then, Mary told him he wasn't going to be sent away. She would come and live in the house with him, and he had felt an overwhelming joy, a feeling he hadn't known in a long time. It was only a week or so later that the nightmares began. It was the same dream every time. He was in a field. It was late at night, and he could hear a girl screaming. And as he got closer to the sound, He could see a young girl dressed in pink pajamas, on her knees with her hands fastened behind her back, and the head of a dead sheep crudely tied to the top of her own. In front of her, a very large man was dancing and chanting some strange words in a strange language. Tied to the top of his head was a very large snake's head, with its mouth gaping and huge fangs are glinting in the moonlight. He was dressed in some sort of red overalls. John had seen some similar to these, but he couldn't recall where. Hanging off the arms and legs of the man was the rest of the sheep's body parts, and what looked like smaller animals, rats and rabbits and birds, all ripped apart and still bleeding, sending splatters of blood around the man's feet as he danced around the cowering girl. Some of the blood was sprayed over the girl, leaving darker patches on her pink pajamas. On seeing the blood, the man went crazy, his voice rising to a high-pitched shriek. John had watched as the girl had slowly lifted her head and turned towards him. He had seen the fear in her eyes as she begged him to help her, but he hadn't been able to move. Not that there was anything he could have done anyway. The crazy man had turned and smiled at him. He knew the face. He had watched in disbelief as the man pulled out a long-bladed knife, tugged the girl's head back, and drew the blade across the exposed flesh. At first, John had thought it was a game of some sort, as nothing had happened. The girl had looked all right, and there was only a faint, thin red line across her throat. But to his horror, the red line grew bigger, and suddenly the girl had another mouth, a mouth that screamed forth a great gush of foaming blood. John had looked deep into the eyes of the madman and had been unable to stop the heart-rending scream that escaped his lips. Then he had waked up, always at the same point. Over the years, he had had many dreams, many different dreams, but all of them contained the same death scene. Sometimes the girl had been different. Sometimes it was a boy, but the man and the final outcome had always been the same. And every time he'd had to stare into those eyes, as the face had turned to him and smiled. But over the years, the face hadn't been so clear. Only his eyes, and that smile. After a while, even the eyes and smile faded, until all he saw was a great serpent's head on top of a man's shoulders. And even that disappeared, and instead of seeing the deathly scene, he now saw the victims. They were coming to him. They were talking to him. They had wanted his help. They pleaded with him. They said only he could help. What the hell could he do to help them? They were dead, and he wasn't. He couldn't change it. Besides, he was only a kid as well. Why was it up to him? They should go and find someone bigger, stronger, braver. But they wouldn't leave him alone. Every night they came. And with every passing night, they looked worse. Their bodies were being transformed into a rotting mess in front of his eyes. And even at 18 years of age, he still couldn't handle it. It was too much for him. He knew he had to get a long way from the house. Maybe then the nightmares might leave him alone. He had no way of knowing for sure, but he had to try. It was a sad day when he said goodbye to Mary. Although he had promised that he would visit her soon, in his heart, he knew that that was a lie. He had almost shed a tear that day, almost. But there just weren't any tears in him to shed. John tried to focus on the madman's face, but no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't picture it. But after all, he had blocked it out a long time ago, so he wasn't really surprised he couldn't visualize it now. He was only a child at the time, so maybe he hadn't recognized the face. Maybe the face was too horrible for him to want to see it again. In any case, that face and that dream seemed to be in the past, and that's where it belonged. John suddenly realized that the bathwater was no longer hot. In fact, it wasn't even warm. He tried the hot water tap, but the water ran cold, so he decided he would have to get out, which was a pity, as he had felt really relaxed. He glanced at the clock, 9:30. He decided to give breakfast a miss and go straight out. He wanted to get started and set up his new business. Now that he had decided to go for it, he didn't want the grass to grow under his feet, so to speak. The first thing he did was check on the advert in the local paper. He wasn't really happy about having to advertise, but he knew that he couldn't afford to just sit back and hope people would find him. Word of mouth was better, but you had to start from somewhere. He had haggled and finally agreed on the rent for the office, and he slowly surveyed the office contents. He hated it, all steel and tubes. It gave him a cold feeling, but as it did come ready furnished, beggars couldn't be choosers. The other office he had looked at was furnished as well, but this one was better located, so he would just have to make the best of it. He wasn't going to bother with an office at all, but as Roy pointed out, it didn't look too professional working from home. After all, a lot of it is all front. If you look like you're doing well, people are more likely to come to you. If you had a shabby office, they would think that you weren't very good at what you do. But if you had a posh office, well, so John thought to hell with the expense. A few jobs, and he would soon earn the money he had outlaid. The advert in the paper hadn't had any response. Maybe people didn't like getting in touch with just a box number. John asked them to run the advert again, and this time was able to give them his new office telephone number. He switched the answering machine on and sat at his desk glaring at it, as though if he stared at it long enough, then a call would come through. He could just go out and check the machine later, but decided that he didn't really have anywhere else to go. Besides, by hanging around in the office, he sort of had a feeling of working. At around 5:30 he'd had enough. Pushing himself from the desk, he decided to call it a night. Before he reached the door, he saw a figure lurking behind the frosted glass. He watched as the figure paced back and forth, as though they were debating with themselves. He was about to snatch the handle when the door opened, and in walked a small woman in a long black coat. The first thing John noticed about her was her long, coppery red hair. He guessed that she was aged around the mid-30s, but she dressed a lot younger. As he stared, the face seemed to look familiar, and then with a sudden shock, he realized why it seemed familiar. It was the girl from his nightmares, the girl whose throat he had seen cut. She was a lot older, but she was the same girl. He was sure of it. The look on her face was the same look she had given him all those years ago. As she advanced towards him, John felt his knees buckle, and then a dark veil covered his eyes before he hit the floor. When he opened his eyes, he was greeted by the concerned woman. "Are you okay?" "Yay, just a little faint." John managed to find his voice. "I'm Cindy Rawlings," she said, holding out her hand. John shook the offered hand. "John Lowe, how can I help you?" "Where to begin?" she said, mainly to herself. "Well, it all happened 29 years ago." She saw the expression on John's face and added, "Please hear me out." John nodded. "Well, my sister went missing, and we have heard nothing since. Surely this is a matter for the police," he said, thinking, shit, this was 29 years ago. Talk about a cold case. This was bloody freezing. "It was years ago," she smiled, and John had a sudden chill and a feeling she had just been inside his head. "But now it's just too long. And well, the police. No offense, But why have you come to me? Have you tried anyone else? How long have you been looking? John stammered. I don't really know why I came to you, she half smiled. I'd often thought about what might have happened to her, but I've never done anything about it. She slowly paced the room. In fact, I don't really know what I'm doing here. She stopped pacing. It's as though something drew me here. I had no intention of coming, but here I am. I didn't even know you were here. Okay, I'll help you if I can, John said, making a quick decision, not sure if it was the right one. Here's a picture of her. Cindy smiled, pulling out a creased black and white snapshot. And this time John really did see a ghost from the past. Chapter 4. John had hardly touched his food. He didn't feel much like eating. He just sat, staring at the old photo, half expecting it to change into a sea view, or a rolling landscape, or something he could at least believe in. But no. The smiling face of the pretty young girl stared back at him. Maybe, he thought, the girl wasn't from a dream at all. Maybe she was an old friend from school, and that's why he recognized her. Maybe bollocks. He knew he was just trying to kid himself. He knew that dream only too well. And he knew without a doubt that the girl in the photo was the girl from his dream. And sitting staring at the bloody thing wasn't going to change anything, no matter how much he prayed. Tomorrow, he would set about trying to find out more about the girl's disappearance. He would like to think he was doing it for Cindy Rawlings. After all, she did set his heart racing. She had a certain something, and not just a ghostly sister. But he knew that the main reason he would get stuck into the case was for him. That after all these years, he might find a clue to the nightmares. He was up at the crack of dawn, and after gulping down his breakfast, he rang the local police station and was happy to hear that Roy would be on duty a little later. When he arrived at the police station, Roy was already waiting for him. What's the matter, John? The craggy-faced cop asked, his eyes worried. John suddenly realized how his phone call must have sounded like from the "There's nothing wrong," he smiled. I'm sorry if I gave that impression. It's just that I need your help. The old man's face relaxed. Hell, kid, I've been waiting here with all sort of things going through my mind. He shook his head and laid a heavy hand on John's shoulder. Well, spit it out, son, and spit it out. He told Roy about the visit he had received from Cindy Rawlings and showed him the dog-eared photo she had given him. He neglected, however, to say anything about the girl being a ghost from his nightmares, or for that matter, about the fact he was having any nightmares. As far as Roy was concerned, this was just a case. But as he glanced up, he caught the slate-gray eyes studying him hard. What's so special about this case? Nothing, John lied. It's just that it's my first case. Hell, kid, you don't strike me as someone who would get all fired up just 'cause it's your first case. John had no answer. He just grinned and shrugged. Roy shook his head and sighed. It's a long time since I've heard this name. He stared hard at the photo. This was one of my first real cases. Hell, it must be over 30 years ago. I can remember this one. I really wanted us to find this girl. He seemed to be talking to himself now. John let him carry on with his monologue. Yay, this was just the first. There was a lot more disappearances after this one. He stopped abruptly and looked sadly at John for a moment before his craggy face broke into a half-hearted smile. Well, let's go and have a look at what we can find. John was tempted to ask for the files on the other cases that Roy had hinted at, but thought that he might be pushing his luck. After all, he had only been back a couple of minutes, and well, Roy was being helpful enough, but who was to say that he was really friendly After all, John didn't mean anything special to him. Behind the easygoing exterior, John knew that there was a hard, shrewd man, taking everything in and not being deceived by anything. He knew that his explanation for being so keen on the case hadn't fooled Roy for 1 minute. But what the hell was he supposed to say? He was chasing a ghost from his past. It was a toss-up on whether to take the files home to read or take them to the office. The office won. Although John wasn't too eager to go there, he didn't want to be distracted by other person. That's if there was any other people coming in with their dilemmas. But he knew that it would be unprofessional to shut down on account of this one case. He could only hope that no new client would turn up. As soon as he arrived at the office, he dived right into the file. It didn't take too long to read. There wasn't that much in it. But one part that he kept rereading was the place of the girl's last sighting. The field. His field. He couldn't help wondering what she was doing in the field. She lived in the next village, and she should have been at school at the time. But there, she was up in the field for no apparent reason. John jotted down the name of the man who had reported the sighting, Henry Woods. The report also indicated that when interviewed, Mr. Woods had been badly beaten, and when asked how it had happened, the man could give no explanation. So of course, he became the main suspect, but nothing ever came of it. The case was never solved, and was just filed away as that of another missing person. A note was attached to the file that she was probably a runaway. She was just 13, and at that age, John felt sick. If they couldn't solve a case, they would put it down as a runaway, doesn't want to be found, and that was that. He sat staring at the open file, half expecting something new to appear, something that would shout, "Hey, here I am. I'm what you're looking for. Now you can solve the case. Wrap it up and get back to your life." But John knew that things were never that simple in the real world. He was brought back down to earth by the sound of the office door opening. His heart skipped a little when he saw Cindy. He wasn't sure if it reacted that way because of how attractive she was, or if it was the voice that had crawled into his head and rasped, "Beware." When she saw him, she gave him a radiant smile. The smile warmed him more than the heating in the office could ever do. He smiled back and crushed the voice before it could utter any more warnings. "I've got the file on your sister, but I'm afraid there's not much to go on." He sighed, getting to his feet. "I didn't think there would be." Noting his expression, she added, "I've been through it all before." He nodded and offered her a chair. Sitting back down opposite her, he was about to speak when she suddenly blurted out, "I'm going to help." He stared at her a moment, not really sure what she meant by her outburst. "What? How?" "I don't know how. I just know that this time I'm going to try and help." She sounded matter-of-fact. "Can you remember what happened the day your sister went missing?" He hadn't intended it to come out the way it had sounded, abrupt. "Of course not. I was so young. But—" She broke off, then went on defensively, "Look, I'm going to help, and that's that." John thought about arguing, but the stubborn expression on her face warned him it would be useless. "Okay, you can help. You can get me all the information on Sandra you can find. Anything at all you can dig up. And I wouldn't mind going to see your parents. After all, you haven't even given me an address yet." He noticed the sudden cloud fall across her face, but it only stayed a moment. "Both my parents are dead. I'm sorry. It was some time ago, but I'll see what I can find on Sandra." John felt like kicking himself, but before he could say another word, she was on her feet and heading for the door. Turning, She shot him a brief smile over her shoulder and was gone. John shook his head. He wasn't sure if he had upset her or not. He suddenly realized that she still hadn't given him an address. He rushed out after her. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, nearly falling when he hit the bottom, he rushed out the main door. The cold air pierced his ears, blowing his untidy hair across his face. He brushed it aside and glanced up and down the street. Nothing. She was nowhere in sight. But she couldn't have moved that speedily. He was only a few seconds after her. As he turned to go back inside, he noticed a large, black cat in the shadow of a doorway opposite. It seemed to turn and smile at him. Was that his cat? No, it couldn't be. Once back in the office, what little warmth the heating gave felt inadequate. He gave an inward shiver and sat back at his desk. Just then the phone rang. He half expected it to be Cindy, but when no one spoke on the other end, he demanded, "Whoever you are, either speak or put the bloody phone down." He was rewarded by a loud, sharp static from the other end, and as he listened, the static sounded more like 1,000 voices chanting the same word, but he couldn't make out what that word was. He suddenly felt stupid. He knew from experience that if you watched the static on a television set after the station had gone off air, you could convince yourself that you were witnessing messages from another planet, and if you watched long enough, you would be able to understand what they were trying to say. He slammed the receiver down and snatched it back up again. The static had gone. Now all he could hear was the dialing tone. The phone seemed okay, but he would ring telecom just to be on the safe side. His mind wandered back to Cindy, and he had an idea. He pulled out the local phone book and let his fingers do the walking. But after a lot of walking, he drew a blank. God, how could he have done something so stupid? To take on a case and not even ask the person's address, or at least their telephone number. Hell, he needed a good kick up the arse. But he wasn't sure if he could manage it. All he could do now was sit and wait for her to get in touch. The phone rang once more. Her, maybe? He snatched up the receiver, and his ear was suddenly filled with a loud hissing sound. As he listened, it grew louder and louder. Is this some kind of a joke? He screamed down the line, going red in the face. I'm sorry, sir, but you asked us to check the line. Oh, I'm sorry. It's just that air eye, John stammered, biting his lip. We've checked the line and we can't find anything wrong. Would you like us to send someone to check for any loose connections at your end? The telecom worker talked politely, not in the least ruffled by John's outburst. No, it will be okay, he said, trying his best to sound just as polite. After an hour of sitting, getting up and pacing the room and then sitting again, John decided that if he didn't do something, he would go out of his mind. He couldn't just hang around the office, waiting for the answers to come to him. He decided that he would go and see Henry Woods. But he knew that finding Henry Woods wasn't going to be straightforward. Nothing ever was for him. After driving to the address on the report, which was a pretty bloody long shot, he drove back to the office and did some ringing round. He was glad he was on the phone and not face to face, as he had to come up with some really good groveling, and after promising favors that would take him at least a month to chip into, he found that Henry Woods had moved away not long after being released from police custody. Although there was nothing to the rumors of his guilt, people liked to have somebody to point the finger at, and they did more than just point the finger at him. After one good beating too many, and an arson attack on his house, he had finally fled. John learned that he was now living at an old people's home in Wrexham, and also he was no longer Henry Woods. He was now Henry Morgan, John guessed he was kind of attached to being a Henry. On the drive down to Wrexham, John tried to decide on the best line of approach. After all, it was a long time ago, and he was bound to stir up old memories. Bad memories. And old. Henry wasn't going to say, "Come in, old friend. I'd love to talk to a complete stranger about the rough time I had. And by the way, I did kill her, and she's buried down a bank by an old oak tree." Well done. You've solved the case that had so many stumped. You really are one hell of a detective. Yay! One hell of a detective, John laughed to himself. But old Henry did welcome him in, and he did say he would love to talk to him. But he never admitted to murder, if of course there ever was a murder, for the body had never been found. There was a chance that Sandra had had an accident, lost her memory, and was now doing well for herself living in Scotland. Thank you very much. But John knew she was dead. He'd seen her killed, at least in a dream. He had dreamt her death, and it seemed real. Henry was a frail old man, and John guessed that the only reason he was telling his story was because he was lonely. And he probably knew his time was running out, and he wanted one last opportunity to convince someone, anyone, of his innocence. John listened to the old man's monologue without interrupting him. He doubted that Henry would have heard him if he did. He seemed to have drifted back in time and was reliving his past experience. The color had drained from his sunken cheeks, and his eyes were glazed over and fixed as he retold his story. "I didn't kill her." He suddenly turned to John. "It wasn't me. And they thought it was, but it wasn't." "How do you know that she is dead?" John urged. After a brief moment, the old man blurted out, "I saw her killed." His eyes had reddened, and the tears flowed freely down his cratered cheeks. John felt a pang of sympathy, but knew he had to keep pushing. "Who killed her, Henry? Who killed her, and why didn't you tell the police?" "Tell them what?" His voice was raised to a high pitch. "Tell them that the devil himself killed her. Tell them it was some goddamned snake monster. Yea, I'm sure they would have believed that." John felt a chill creep over his heart. The devil. What do you mean, the devil? It was the devil, all right. He was covered in flesh and blood and fur he had ripped from his prey, and on his head was the biggest set of fangs set into a gaping mouth, and the noise he made was inhuman. Henry was speaking in a near whisper now. John's nightmare suddenly came to life. Had Henry had the same nightmare, or had he really seen the slaying? John's heart was beating so fast that he thought his chest would explode at any moment. V had enough now. Leave me alone. Henry was no longer friendly. In fact, he seemed quite savage now. "Before I go, how do you know it was Sandra Rawlings?" "Of course I know it was Sandra Rawlings. I knew the family very well." Strange, John thought. Why hadn't Cindy mentioned this? Her parents must have spoken of him at one time or another. John tried a softer approach. "It must have been hard on her parents. And on you. What with you being a friend of the family. It must have been hard them treating you as a suspect." The old man was on his feet now, and was waving his finger hard enough to shake it off. "They never did believe I had anything to do with it. They were the only ones who didn't think so." He suddenly slumped back into his seat, dejected. "I'm sorry, but what about Cindy? How did she take it?" "Cindy? Who's Cindy?" "Cindy, Sandra's sister." "Look, mister, I don't know what game you're trying to play, but she had no sister." Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe she was born after Sandra's disappearance. A nagging fear started to gnaw away at his chest. Chapter 5. Back in the office, he checked his answering machine for the faint chance that Cindy might have rung. She hadn't, nor had anyone else. John felt slightly deflated. Although he didn't really want anyone else to come with their problems, it still would be encouraging to be in some sort of demand. Well, he was a detective, so that was what he would do. Detect. Only now he wanted to detect the person that had hired him to detect, Cindy Rawlings. He called a friend who had access to credit search and drew a blank. So what did that prove, he mused. She wasn't in the phone book, or had any credit, or wasn't in any debt. She could be living with someone, and the numbers listed in the other person's name. Simple. He calls a friend in the DHSS, and drew a blank there too, so she wasn't claiming benefit, which would support the theory that she was living with someone. She might even be married. John didn't know why, but this thought didn't cheer him up one little bit. He flushed and pushed the thought out of his mind. Besides, if she was married, why had she used her maiden name? And why not just say she was married? Yea, and why not give him some way of contacting her? The rest of the day sneaked by without event. It was already dark when John arrived back at the house, and the only sound in the night air was the crunch of his boots on the thin layer of frost that was icing the path. Clouds formed about his face at every breath he took. He stopped and listened. Nothing. He was out in the wilds, but he still expected to hear traffic from the main road. After all, it was rush hour now. But no sound filtered up to him. There were no nightbirds, no breeze, and no planes overhead. Nothing. John felt an icy chill crawl down his spine, and he suddenly had the feeling he was being watched. His glance darted about the dark surroundings. Nothing looked out of place. But what caught his attention were the trees swaying back and forth in the wind. Yet there was no wind. At least no wind he could hear or feel. Perhaps I'm coming down with a cold, he thought. Just then, a sound did come to his ears. It was only slight, but he heard it as if it had come from inside his head. He turned to see the black cat, bathed in moonlight, watching him carefully through one eye. It slowly got up and walked into the shadows. He was about to follow it when a figure came gliding round the corner. John stopped in his tracks, his heart thumping. An intruder was his first thought, but if so, it was an intruder that didn't seem too scared of being caught. He stared at the black-clad figure, but made no move towards it. If there's going to be a confrontation, I'd prefer it to be out here in the open, he decided. But there was no fight. John felt his heart beat again with a jolt. Beneath the black bobble hat the intruder was wearing, the moonlight illuminated the white face that was no longer hidden by the shadows. I'm sorry I scared you, Cindy smiled. John had the feeling she wasn't sorry in the least. I know it's late, but I had to see you. He felt like returning some smart remark to make her feel awkward, but he just didn't have a smart remark in him, so the best he could do was grunt and open the front door. Once inside, he rounded on her, about to give her a piece of his mind. But the smiling face that looked so innocent melted away what anger he had. I don't know. You shouldn't go sneaking in the shadows. You could get yourself hurt, he said with a laugh, shaking his finger at her in mock rebuke. Look, she responded. How about a drink? I've only got tea or coffee, he replied, apologetically. That's fine. She turned and made her way to the kitchen. John followed her and watched as she set about making the drinks. As he watched, he became concerned at something rather odd. She didn't need to root round for the cups, coffee, spoon, nothing. She just went straight to the right drawer or cupboard, no hesitation. Hell, John thought, I'm letting my imagination run away with me. It's ever since I came back to this God-forsaken place. It's no big deal, so she knows where things are without having to ask. I wouldn't be surprised if I couldn't go to her house and do the very same thing. If I knew where she lived, that is. He mumbled to himself. I'm sorry, what was that? Nothing. He hadn't realized that he had spoken aloud. He accepted the mug of coffee from Cindy, and they returned to the front room. They both sat there sipping the steaming liquid, neither apparently wishing to be the first to speak. As much as John liked sitting there with her, he knew that Cindy hadn't just come round for a cup of coffee. Finally, John broke the silence. It's good to see you, Cindy, but you're not after a progress report already, are you? He said lightheartedly. Of course not, she smiled. You don't have to worry. I'm not one of those people who wants results yesterday. It would be great, but I know you can't work miracles. She hesitated a moment, as if trying to find the right words. Well, you know I want to help as much as I can. I was thinking the other night, and I remembered my parents talking about a man whom the police had questioned. John interrupted the flow. This man, he wouldn't happen to be Henry Woods, would he? Why, yes. How do you know? She cast him a look of angry perplexity. I've already talked to him. No joy. He shrugged. But his saw. She stopped in mid-sentence. The vexation that had suddenly boiled up in her didn't escape John's notice. Although it had only been there an instant, the look in her eyes had sent an army of goose pimples marching down his spine. And as he watched her, he had the feeling she was fighting hard to get her anger under control. She stared back at him, as if wondering if he was aware of her sudden annoyance. John smiled at her, hiding any sign that he had indeed noticed. Cindy sank back a little in the chair. I remember, she continued, my parents saying that the police tried to blame him for Sandra's disappearance, but they never thought he had anything to do with it. He told them he saw someone attacking my sister in the field across from this house, but he wouldn't tell this story to the police for some reason. She suddenly propelled herself off the chair and ran to the window. Pulling back the curtain, she pointed to the field. That field, she cried. Her gaze turned accusingly towards John. Wow, hold on there. That's not my field, he exclaimed, hands held high. Cindy stared at him, stony-eyed a moment longer, and then sank to her knees, her body raked with uncontrollable sobbing. John rushed over to her and gently put his arms around her shoulders. This action seemed to set off a tripwire, and the whole room was soon resounding with her wails. John had never been very good with women, and he certainly didn't know how to act now. He decided that the best thing to do was to do nothing. He sat on the floor, arm around Cindy, for at least 10 minutes before the sobbing started to subside. At last she turned to look at him with red-rimmed eyes. I'm sorry, she sniffed. You must think I'm stupid getting so upset after all these years about a sister I never really knew. But, well, I'm just like that. It's not stupid. I often wish I could have feelings like that, John whispered, but not really convinced that that was the only reason for her outburst. Cindy leaned forward and lightly kissed him on the cheek, then nestled her head against his chest. John sighed. He hadn't had a moment like this for a long time, but something inside told him it wasn't right. It was strange that she should get so upset about her long-lost sister. After all, as she said, she couldn't possibly remembering her. And it also seemed strange that she had suddenly remembered her parents going on about Henry Woods. Hell, her parents wouldn't be discussing the matter with her. He didn't know just how old she was when her parents died, but she had hinted at being very young. So unless she had overheard them talking, he doubted very much that they had told her the story themselves. He realized that he really didn't know anything about her past life, or for that matter, her present life. Until now, it had never really mattered that he hadn't known anything about his clients. The cases had always been straightforward, but this case was far from that. "Look, Cindy," he decided, "tell me more about yourself, your past, present, anything." She studied him for a long time before making up her mind. "Well, I guess I'm just an average girl," she said, brushing away her remaining tears and fluttering her eyelashes. "Just an average, working girl," John persisted. "Yes, just an average working girl, although nothing glamorous. I work in an Army and Navy store." "Wow, that is glamorous," John mocked. "Where?" "Where? Oh, Aaron Chester." "Chester? I haven't been there for a very long time. Maybe I can meet you for lunch sometime?" "Maybe," she said, in a tone that cried, "Not a chance." Perhaps it's just as well, John thought, slightly taken back. There is a golden rule. Don't get mixed up with a client. And as he knew only too well, it was a bloody good rule, one that shouldn't be broken. "I don't even know where you live," he said. "Why would you want to know that?" She eyed him suspiciously. "Well, for the records, for one thing." "I don't want to go on any record," she growled. "Okay, then. What about a phone number in case I need to get hold of you?" "I'll be in touch regularly," she returned stubbornly. "Oh, come on, Cindy. I'm not asking that much, as he exclaimed, getting a bit fed up with the whole thing. "No, you're not. I'm sorry, it's Chester 317718. "Well, thank you," John grinned. "I promise I won't ring in the middle of the night and spoil your beauty sleep." "Oh, so you think I need my beauty sleep, do you?" She growled light-heartedly, throwing a fake punch. John threw his hands up over his head. "Please, no more beatings, master," he wailed, in a crappy southern Negro accent. The tension that had built up quickly melted away at this moment. For the next 2 hours, they chatted about her past, his past, and their school days. Although they had attended the same school, they had never met. She was nearly 2 years younger, it turned out, but the school was only a small one, and he recalled that everyone knew just about everyone. Well, not everyone, it seemed. John started to think that perhaps he'd known her sister, and that was why he kept having the nightmares. Maybe he had witnessed her murder and swept it to the back of his mind. It certainly wasn't uncommon for people to block out really horrible events in their lives, and that would account for the nightmares. The thought didn't really appeal to him. Here was Cindy trying to find out what had happened to her sister, and maybe he had seen her murdered. One thing was for sure, and that was he wasn't about to tell her of his dreams. For one thing, she might think he was mad, or worse. The answer was in the field. John was sure of it. But how was he going to find anything? After all these years, there wouldn't be anything waiting up there for him to discover. And he couldn't go up there with a shovel and dig the place up, even if he wanted to. But maybe he could dig in just one spot. He knew the dream so well by now. Not just the girl and the freak, hacking her up, but he knew every tree, every rise in the ground, and every hedge in the background. The place had never rung any bells with him, but if he went up into the field and walked every square inch, then if the spot was up there, he'd find it. He knew that this was the thing to do after seeing Old Man Woods, but he didn't really have the bottle to do it. Tomorrow morning, however, he would find the bottle. He suddenly had the feeling of eyes boring into him. He turned and saw Cindy, head cocked, staring hard at him. "Penny for your thoughts," she offered. "I'm sorry. I was miles away then. In fact, I'm really tired," he jibbed. "Well, it is getting late. I'll be on my way." She stood up, taking the cue. I wasn't trying to get rid of you. You can stay longer if you wish, John said quickly. No thanks, I really must go. John was relieved. Although he liked her company, he needed time to think. When they reached the door, he suddenly had a pang of guilt at not offering to drive her home. I can give you a lift, he quickly added. No thank you, I'm all right. I've left my car just down the lane. John was sure that he hadn't seen any car when he arrived home, but he didn't push it. Maybe she wanted to walk. He doubted it very much, as it was a good 7 miles to Chester, or even if she lived on the outskirts, within the Chester code, it was still at least 3 miles. After she had left, he went back into the kitchen to make himself another drink. He was filling the kettle when something caught his eye. Standing on the fridge was Cindy S. handbag. He slowly walked towards it as if it was a sacred object. He suddenly had the urge to open it and scatter its contents on the floor. Maybe that way he would get to know a bit more about her, not just the things she wanted him to know. But he pushed the urge aside and just stared at it. He was startled out of his trance by a loud, heavy knock on the front door. He swept up the bag and rushed to answer it. You forgot this, he said, swinging the door open and displaying the bag in his outstretched hand. But the face staring back at him wasn't Cindy S., but the craggy, well-lived-in face of Roy. I guess you thought I was someone else, he grinned. John reddened and stammered. Hi, Roy. A girl air friend just left and she forgot this. I thought you was her. Hell, you have them doing their own washing up after they do you. Roy laughed. John looked, puzzled. The tea towel. Roy nodded at John's hand. John glanced at it and couldn't believe his eyes. The bag had gone, and in its place was a tea towel. Shit, I really am tired, he thought. He craned his neck round Roy, trying to see down the lane. What are you looking for? Roy asked, also craning his head. The girl, the women who just left. Roy stared at John hard, seeing the confused look on his face. Well, if she just left, I believe you, but I've just come up the lane, and I sure as hell didn't pass anyone. John glared at him, utterly confused. Look, boys, how about us going inside, have a drink, and you can tell me all about it, said Roy comfortingly. Chapter 6. Roy stayed well over an hour too long, as far as John was concerned. He was glad to see him, but didn't really want to talk about the case, and he certainly didn't want to discuss Cindy. In the end, he told Roy as much about the affair as he dared, without mentioning Cindy. After all, he thought, Roy had worked on the case the first time around, and God only knew he needed some help. Maybe Roy might have some information that might prove useful. He half expected Roy to guess that it was Sandra's sister that had hired him, but he said nothing. In fact, he never even asked who had hired him. When John finally managed to get rid of Roy, without being obvious, he went straight to bed and was asleep almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. But it was by no means a peaceful sleep. The nightmares came, and he had to witness Sandra's ordeal once more. But this time, it was 10 times worse. For this time the girl had a name, she was now a real person, and this time he could feel pain. The next morning he was up and out early. There was a thin layer of frost on the ground, and his breath bellowed out like smoke balls, and almost froze as it left his mouth. He debated on whether to go back inside and wait till it warmed up a bit, or get on with the task in hand. The task in hand won, but he wasn't quite sure how. He left a trail of crushed frosted grass as he beat a path through the field. As soon as his feet had hit the ground on the other side of the gate, he had begun to feel lightheaded. He tried to screw his eyes tightly shut, but all that did was to send bright lights cascading through his skull. He knew that something didn't want him in the field, but couldn't help feeling daft for believing this, and he would be even dafter if he let it scare him off. So he carried on with his quest, his feet getting heavier with every step. He had an idea just where he was going to look, and after only half an hour, he came upon the spot from his nightmares. Well, at least it looked like the spot. He was almost certain. Something on the ground caught his eye. He kicked it with the toe of his boot. He knew that the fire must have been a recent one, because if it had been an old one, the pieces of half-burnt paper would have blown away before the frost had come down. John tried to peel the bits of paper apart, but when the frost finally gave up its grip, all he managed to do was rip the fragments even smaller. He searched the area for another half hour, not really expecting to find anything that would help his case. He wasn't disappointed. He found absolutely nothing. But someone had been in the field, somebody recently, and he or she had lit a fire. But who the hell would be camping out this time of year? It could be a tramp, or even kids. But if it had been kids, they would have had a tent. Why else light a fire? But as far as he could see, there was no sign of a tent ever being there, so that left the tramp. But even tramps would have found a better spot to sleep than an open field. So who? The sun was climbing up over the horizon, and the frost retreated from the warm yellow rays that washed over everything in sight. Only the frost that remained in the shade was being stubborn, but the sun would win in the end, thought John. Although he didn't really like the frost, he always felt kind of really clean when it was a crisp morning like this one. So the frost melted away, and he began to question just what he was doing up in a field at such a ridiculously early hour. He started back down the slope, and the closer he got to the gate, the more quickly the headache that had plagued him for the last hour or so started to subside. And as soon as he leapt over the gate, the headache completely vanished. He felt as though a heavy weight had suddenly been snatched off his head. Well, what was the strategy now? What, no idea? Well, he'd better go and have a drink and think of one. Hell, he had set off this morning with what he thought was a good plan, but when he thought about it, it wasn't really a plan at all. It was just something to make him feel he was going into action. Ah, what was the use? He was just kidding himself. He knew that this action was even less than nothing. If he was truthful with himself, he didn't even have a good excuse for taking the job in the first place. Sure, it was a ghost from his past, but even he knew he couldn't keep chasing a ghost from 30 years ago. There was the fact that Cindy was sure a good-looking lady, but hell, she wouldn't think much of him if he just strung her along and simply took the money. That was a point. He hadn't had a penny from her yet, and the way the case was going, he wouldn't have the nerve to ask for any. He sighed inwardly. He knew that somehow Cindy and her sister were mixed up in his troubled past. Her sister had been his main bloody nightmare in his childhood, for Christ's sake. And what was more, his main bloody nightmare since he had been back. But what the hell could he do? After all, he wasn't bloody Columbo. He was really just a novice at this type of detective work, and this case had stumped the experts for 30 years. So what did he hope to find in just a few days? Nothing. And what's more, he knew that that would be all he would solve in this case. Bloody nothing. As he dragged himself up the path, he noticed the black cat watching him. No, the look on the cat's face seemed to be accusing him. John shrugged his shoulders. Even the cat knew him for what he was. He opened the front door and stopped halfway over the threshold. He turned back round to stare at the offending cat. but the cat had gone. "What have I done to feel guilty about?" he hissed out into the direction the cat might have taken. He back-heeled the door behind him so hard that it rattled in its jambs, and then he hobbled into the front room and threw himself into the nearest chair. He sat, heart pounding, thinking of ways of breaking it to Cindy that he could no longer take the case. After half an hour, he was still no wiser as to how he was going to tell her. But tell her he must, and now was as good a time as any. He reached over and grabbed the phone. But what was the number? He couldn't remember it to save his life, but he had known this would happen. So as soon as she had left, he had written it down. But where the hell was that bloody piece of paper he had scribbled it on? He searched high and low, but couldn't find the bloody thing. Cursing, he decided that he would make a drink, sit down, and hope that it would come to him in the meantime. His temper had risen to such a pitch that in the end he was searching in the same place time after time. As soon as he opened the cupboard where the tea was kept, he let out a small bark of laughter. Staring back at him was the piece of paper with the number on it. John strolled over to the phone. Now that he had found the number, he wasn't in that much of a hurry to ring it. Making up his mind, he snatched up the phone and dialed. Nothing. He stared at the number, 317718. It was a local number, so it didn't need a code. He dialed again, this time putting the area code in front of it. Still nothing. Maybe he had written it down wrong. He tried a few variations on the digits. He got through to a taxi firm, the local gateway store, and one very angry man who wasn't the least bit pleased at being woken at what he called an unearthly time. John dropped the receiver back into place and stared at it, half expecting the guy on the other end to come hurling out of it to stick one on him. He hadn't realized just how early it still was. He felt as though he had been up for hours. But then again, he had. So Cindy had given him a dud number. He felt rather hurt, and a hell of a lot annoyed. Shit, he was supposed to be working for her. So why on earth was she lying to him? Well, now he wouldn't feel so guilty about dropping the case. He slumped back into the chair and let out a heavy sigh. He was starting to feel tired now. He shouldn't do. He had been up a lot earlier than this, many a time, and done a full day and night on top of it. The Army and Navy store. It suddenly came to him that was where she said she worked. An Army and Navy store in Chester. There were 2 stores in Chester, and after ringing both of them, all it did was piss him off. Cindy didn't work in any of them. In fact, no one had bloody even heard of her, unless they were lying, and he couldn't see any reason why they should. So what now? The only thing he could do was waiting for her to get in touch with him. He was becoming a real expert on waiting on her. Maybe a hot bath would help calm him down. The cold had seeped into his bones, making him even more depressed. Maybe later, he would go to the office to see if anything had turned up. He didn't know what would turn up, but hey. He let the hot water wash over him and felt his tightly knotted muscles start to relax. Suddenly, strong hands grabbed his head and pushed his whole body down into the water. He felt the soapy liquid fill his lungs and gasped at the foul taste, omitting his last breath of air. He thrashed his arms and legs about, spilling as much of the bath water as he could, and blindly searched for the plug. He tried to open his eyes to get a glimpse of his attacker, but the water stung them and blurred his vision. Reaching behind, he managed to free one of the hands that held him, and turning his head, he sunk his teeth in hard until they hit bone. He ground them together and could taste the coppery tang of fresh blood as he ripped the flesh away. A high-pitched squeal bounced round the small bathroom, but instead of letting go, the grip on his head got harder. John felt his seances real. He knew that it was only a matter of time before he passed out, and if he did, he knew that it would be the end for him. But as much as he tried to break the grip, he couldn't, and there was nothing he could do as the darkness marched out and claimed him. John's eyes flickered and then opened. He tried to focus, but everything was blurred. With the tips of his fingers, he gently rubbed the dried soap from his sore lids. Slowly, he remembered being attacked. But why was he still alive? And more to the point, who wanted him dead? If someone did want him dead, maybe he was closer on the case than he thought. But if someone wanted him dead, he had no doubt that he would be dead, so somebody was trying to scare him. Well, they had bloody succeeded. But if they had taken the time to ask, they would have known that they need not have bothered. John realized with a shiver that he was now sitting in a bath with no water. Looking around the room, he saw the plug by the foot of the door. He couldn't remember getting to the plug. What he noticed was that there was no sign of any wet footprints or blood. He was sure that he had inflicted a deep injury, so why no blood? And why was the door shut as he had left it? Maybe his attacker liked to be orderly. Weakly, John climbed out of the empty tub. He shook his damp hair and tied it back, something that he would normally never do without drying it first. Then, getting dressed, he slowly opened the door. He was ready to dive back inside at the first sight of a two-headed monster with an axe. But there was no monster, only the bloody cat sitting just outside as though waiting for him to finish in the bathroom and ready to take his turns in there. John let out a deep breath and slowly peered around the door. Nothing. No sign of anything out of the normal. As John approached the cat, it let out a sharp hiss. He stopped, concerned, and then noticed the pool of blood by its front paw. The cat hissed again, then stood, shook its injured paw, and trotted down the stairs. John quickly followed, but by the time he was at the bottom, the cat was nowhere to be seen. After a quick search of the house, John found that it was still well secured. If someone had been in the house, then they had locked up again after they left. "What the hell's going on?" John demanded from his reflection as he passed the hall mirror. "Beats me." The familiar-looking guy shrugged. John suddenly had a thought, one that unnerved him. The last time that he had seen the cat, it was outside, and it sure as hell didn't come in when he did. So unless it had had a key cut, how did the bloody thing get in? And, just as big a mystery, how had it got back out? Things had gone bad as soon as he had returned to this God-forsaken place, and things always went twice as bad when that cat was around. John got some stain cleaner and a cloth, and went up to wipe the blood away before it ground into deep and stained. But things were never that simple. Reaching the top of the stairs, he could see that the blood had gone. Kicking round in the carpet pile, as though he would suddenly find the blood beneath some dust or dirt, John vented a loud scream. He had had just about as much of this house as he could take. He had to get out, and he could feel his head spinning, and the foul taste of bile rises in his throat. He knew that if he didn't escape quickly, he would throw up. The drive into town seemed to take forever. Even the sun shining on this crisp November morning couldn't make John feel any better. Once inside his office, he began to feel safe, if safe was the right word, as though his office was his secure haven from the outside world. Checking the answering machine, he found that he had had only one call, and that call wasn't from Cindy. Not that he had expected one from her. He had just hoped. Roy had sounded urgent, and John was intrigued to find out what it was he had wanted. But he could wait, so he would sit back and wait for him to call back. Picking up the daily paper, the headline screamed at him. 6 school children had gone missing in as many weeks. This was startling enough news, but what jumped out at John was the fact that they all disappeared within a 10-mile radius of Buckley. How was it that he hadn't heard anything about it? In a small place like this, the gossip flies well ahead of the news. How was it that all the gossip mongers had missed this one? Perhaps it was him. He had been so preoccupied that he hadn't noticed much of what was going on around him. A loud rapping on the glass-paneled door startled him so much he nearly dropped the paper. "Come in!" he yelled, half expecting to see Cindy S.'s smiling face. But Cindy S.'s smiling face had aged and now looked a lot like Roy's. And the face certainly didn't have a smile on it. In fact, the face looked downright unfriendly. "What's the matter, Roy?" John said, scrambling to his feet. "I'll get straight to the point, and I don't want any smart-assed answers," Roy growled, his granite eyes boring deep into John. "Do you know Henry Woods?" John stared at the older man and realized that the best thing to do was to tell the truth. "Sure, I went to see him the other day. Why?" The old man seemed to relax, and John was glad that he had decided to tell the truth. Roy settled into a chair before replying. "Because he's been murdered, that's why." John felt as though someone had punched him in the gut and clean knocked the wind out of him. He fell back into the chair with a thud. Who would want to kill him? A burglar. That could be the only answer. It was no burglar that killed this guy. It was one sick bastard. Roy told him every gory, grisly detail of how old Man Woods had died. And by the time he had finished, John felt as though he had aged at least 10 years, and what strength he had drained into the carpet under his feet. "So," Roy whispered, "I would be much obliged if you could give me any help you can." John looked at the man sitting in front of him. He no longer looked a big, tough fellow, and he now looked like an aging pensioner going to a fancy dress ball. John decided to tell him about the case, and about Cindy. "Well, John, if you're telling me right, then you has been had." "What do you mean?" "I've been had." "Had by whom?" "By this Cindy, if that is her name. But whoever she is, she ain't T. Sandra Rawlings' sister, nor, as far as I know, any relation of Sandra's." So what was the reason for all the lies? And if she wasn't Sandra's sister, then who was she? And what was her concern in the case? What was her motive? John was in no doubt that she'd known more about the case than she'd let on. "Well, I'll be off now," Roy said, getting to his feet, now looking back to his former self. "I'll call round tonight, and we'll discuss it some more." The way the words were spoken sounded very much like a threat, and John was suddenly left with the feeling that he no longer cared if tonight never came. He showed Roy to the door and watched the big man as he swayed down the stairs, daring anyone to get in his way. And he had an image appear in his head of John Wayne in a British copper's outfit. John waited all day, but apart from a few prank calls, nothing came in. No new cases, nothing. He was willing to take on anything at the moment. It would serve as one excuse to tell Cindy to stuff the case. He couldn't get the killing of Henry Woods out of his mind. Something kept gnawing away at him, telling him that if he hadn't gone to see the old man, he would still be alive. By 5 o'clock, he still hadn't had any word from Cindy, so he decided that he would call it a day. After all, Roy hadn't said what time he intended to come round, and if he wasn't there, then he might think he was trying to avoid the issue. Leaving the office, he was surprised by how dark it had become, and the night air had a real bite to it, so he pulled his collar up as far as he could, and half trotted, half ran to the car park opposite. Opening the car door and jumping in behind the wheel, he said a quiet prayer, and was rewarded by the sound of the engine kicking into life at the first turn of the key. The drive home was only about 10 minutes, but it felt like a lot longer than that to John. As he turned into the lane that led to his house, he thought he saw something in the hedge as his lights shone on it. He switched them on to full beam, but there was nothing visible. He was about 30 yards from his home when something jumped out into the road ahead. It was a dark figure, and even his headlights didn't illuminate any features. "What the hell's his game?" John cursed, slamming on his brakes. But the brakes didn't work. John stamped on the pedal again, still nothing. He watched, as if in slow motion, as the figure slowly turned, and his headlights suddenly picked out the smooth features of Cindy. John watched in horror as she smiled and waved at him, making no effort to move out of the way of the oncoming vehicle. Instead, she started to walk towards it. John tried the brakes once more, but instead of slowing down, the car hurtled forwards. He felt the impact and stared in horror as one moment she was there, the next she was gone. He felt sick as he felt the car rise as it rode over her body. After another 10 yards, the car came to a grinding halt. It was as though the brakes had only just realized that they had been pressed. John jumped out and ran to the heap in the middle of the road. Cindy looked up and smiled a crooked smile. "Don't be too long," she whispered. He only half heard the words as he ripped his coat off and draped it over her. At that moment, a car's headlights fell across them, bathing them in an eerie yellow glow. John scrambled to his feet and ran to meet it, arms waving wildly. "What the hell's going on?" Roy yelled, hanging out the window and bringing the car to a shuddering halt. "Call an ambulance. I've run over her." "Run over whom, boy?" "Cindy, quick!" Roy charged past him and knelt beside the body in the road. "Is this some kind of a joke?" Roy screamed, turning to John, his face going an angry purple. "What do you mean, some kind of a joke?" John hissed back, amazed at Roy's actions. "Call a fucking ambulance now." Roy got to his feet in one easy movement and grabbed him by the shoulder and threw him down beside the body on the ground. "So this is Cindy, is it?" he spat. John looked at Roy as though he had just landed from another planet and had ordered pizza and chips to go. What the hell was he playing at? Had he gone mad? "Look, she's bloody dying," John pleaded, turning to the limp bundle. But it wasn't Cindy, if it was her. She'd suddenly lost a lot of weight, and her hair had turned jet black. John's jaw fell open. It was Cindy. He saw her. He had hit her for God's sake. So where was she? He sat on the cold tarmac, gently rocking to and fro. Roy put a comforting hand on his shoulder, but he didn't notice. He didn't notice anything. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the limp body of the lifeless cat that was protruding from beneath his coat. Chapter 7. He sipped the steaming coffee that Roy had made without really tasting it. Was he going mad? He had seen Cindy. He'd spoken to her, and there was no bloody way he could get her mixed up with a cat. So where did she go? Perhaps she wasn't dead, and when he had run to meet the car, she had got up and placed the cat under the coat. And maybe bullshit, his common sense screamed. John's mind was racing 20 to the dozen, but it wasn't racing to any conclusions. Nothing seemed to drop into place. He suddenly realized that Roy was speaking. "I'm sorry, what was that?" "Well, the reason I called tonight," the big man began, not looking from his coffee, "was I could do with some help. This recent spate of kids going missing. Well, to be frank, we suspected Woods 30 years ago. We always knew that he knew more than he was letting on, but we just couldn't prove anything. And with this recent lot, we thought Woods might be behind it. I tried keeping an eye on him, but, well, you know." John had been listening hard so as not to let his mind go a-wandering. The big man seemed to be blaming himself for Wood's death. Maybe some parent of one of the kids that's gone missing may have thought the same and taken the law into their own hands. I thought of that, but there would be no way that any parents could know about Woods or about the kids who went missing 30 years ago. John wasn't so sure. He'd found in his career that the public knew a lot more than the police imagined, but he didn't say as much. Look on the bright side, someone might have done you a favor. Roy raised his head and gave John an ugly stare. There I go, putting my big foot in it again. John mentally scolded himself, waiting for the lecture. But the rebuke never came. The big cop in front of him just shook his head and sighed. I only wish that was the case, but another kid's gone missing since Wood's death. John took the words and rolled them around in his mind. Maybe just a coincidence. Can you be sure this one's the same? I can't be sure of anything, but I feel it here. The granite-faced man hissed, hitting his barrel chest with a hollow thud. John looked at him with a pang of sympathy. He really did appear to be in need of some help, and this case seemed to be eating away at him. John guessed that his failure to solve the puzzle all those years ago was making him even more determined to solve this one now. But 30 years ago, he was just starting out. He couldn't blame himself. John felt like telling him this, but looking at the man in front of him, he thought he might just be pushing what friendship they had a little too far. Roy opened the case he had brought with him and pulled out a thick bundle of files. Tossing them over him, grinned, "Read them and tell me what you make of it." "What now?" John gasped. "It'll take all night." "I've nothing planned, have you?" Before he could answer, Roy quickly produced another set of files, even thicker than the last lot. "And when you've read them, you can go through these. They're the case files from 30 years ago." "Hey," John protested. "Won't you get in trouble for showing me these?" "In deep shit, but no one's going to find out, are they?" John shook his head in submission and set about reading the files. It was a task he did reluctantly at first, but as he read, his eagerness kicked into gear, and his detective instincts were back on overdrive. He only paused a couple of times to ask a few questions, and the files were finished in just over 2 hours. Closing the last file, he drew in a deep breath and asked, "Okay, what am I looking for?" "A pattern, something that ties these people together." "But I couldn't see any pattern. All these people are different. They come from all walks of life. Some are out of work, some professional, and one of them is the mayor's son." "That's it," John suddenly exclaimed. "Now I see what's eating you." "Hey, I'm just as concerned about the out-of-workers kids." Roy jumped on him, anger rising. "I'm sorry that remark was uncalled for," John quickly added. "Maybe it would be a good idea to read their other set of files in the morning." Roy stood up, his annoyance clearly still there. John knew that he must have hit a raw nerve, but didn't argue. It would be best to let him cool down. He just couldn't help saying the wrong things lately, he reflected. After Roy had left, John tried to watch some television, but after an hour he gave up. He wasn't watching the program so much as staring at the screen. He decided that all the reading had tired him out. and an early night was called for. He wasn't really tired, more like drained. It had been one hell of a day. As he started to climb the stairs, something he saw from the corner of his eye caught his attention. In the corner of the hall, by the front door, lay a half-eaten mouse, a legacy of the black cat. Funny, he hadn't noticed it earlier, but then again, he hadn't noticed anything earlier. He went to the kitchen to get a pan and brush. He wasn't one of those people who could just go over to it, grab it by the tail and hurl it out, dead or not. No way was he going to touch it. Just as he bent down to scoop up the half-consumed dinner, the blood-clotted, Mickey-like face turned and looked up at him. "Well, buddy, you're getting there, but you've still a long way to go." It gave a little wink, then fell back into place. "Hell, I really must be going mad," John exclaimed, scooping up the mouse and hurling it as far as he could across the front lawn. John was shopping at the local store when he happened to glance up from the frozen meals, and across the other end of the shop stood Cindy, as large as life. She sported a nasty black eye, but apart from that, she seemed okay, so he had been right. She had got up and done a runner. The nagging image of the cat crossed his mind, but he brushed that aside easily. He called her name, and although half the store's customers turned to look at him, Cindy didn't seem to hear. Using his trolley as a battering ram, he darted towards her. But every time he got to another aisle, she was nowhere to be seen. He was about to give up when he saw her leaving the store. Abandoning his shopping, he quickly followed her. He finally caught up with her as she was getting into the lift that led to the upstairs car park. He pushed in beside her. They were alone in the lift. "Hey, Cindy, just what the hell's going on? I run you down, and when I look, there is this bloody cat in your place, and you are nowhere to be seen." He blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. He realized just how daft he sounded, but things were going over so fast in his mind that the words just weren't coming out as he meant them to. "Well, buddy, I'd like to tell you, but we've still got a long way to go." Until now, John had avoided looking at her, but when he heard the voice, he shot round to stare at Cindy. But it wasn't Cindy. It was a giant Mr. Mouse, and it looked the worse for wear. White maggots were crawling in and out of the hanging flesh wounds, and as John watched repulsed, a handful fell by his feet and started squirming around his boots. He tried to back away, but the mouse-like thing followed him step by step. He didn't realize the lift was so big, or at least it felt big. He smelt the rotting corpse and closed his eyes tight and told himself that it wasn't really happening. It was just another one of his dreams. But as much as he told himself, it was a dream he still couldn't help feeling trapped, powerless. He tried to raise his arms to ward off the revolting rodent, but couldn't. He have any command over them at all. "Well, buddy, what you going to do? What you going to do to stop me?" The rodent mocked. John could feel its whiskers against his cheek. They felt like tiny razors. He watched in horror as the thing laid its claws on his shoulders and slowly started to stroke his chin with a large, curled talon. John was suddenly aware of pain and the hot blood trickling down his neck. The Cindy mouse noticed and stooped its head to suck on the escaping fluid. It was all too much for John. He felt his stomach roll over twice, then the bile rising in his throat. He vomited all over the rat thing, but unlike the last time he emptied his guts, it didn't disappear. It seemed to look hurt, and as he watched, the rat's head took on the form of the black cat for an instant. Then for a brief moment, it was Cindy. Then everything went dark, and John felt himself being pulled by some sort of invisible cord. When John opened his eyes, He was where he expected to be, in his bed. Another bloody nightmare. But although it had been unpleasant, he was no longer scared by his dreams. In fact, he welcomed them in an odd way. He knew that there was a message in them, but what message, and from whom? He glanced down at his covers and saw a grim reminder once more of the dream. He was suddenly aware of something trickling down his neck. Raising a finger, he gingerly inspected the gash on his chin. So that much at least was real, and so too was the half-eaten mouse that was almost hidden beneath the recent vomit. A phrase that he had heard as a kid and always stuck with him came to mind. He didn't know who had said it, but it was a good saying, and one he had often used when he had no answer. He spoke the words aloud, as though they were some magical spell. Is life a dream, or are dreams a reality? In this case, he sure didn't know. He got dressed, and then slung the mouse out of the window. Not waiting to see where it would land, he lumbered downstairs. He thought about breakfast, but his protesting, tender stomach made it quite clear that any food was as welcome as a dose of. He felt that he should rebel against his gut feeling, but a heavy knocking on the door, announcing the arrival of Roy, made the decision for him. Glancing at his watch, John saw that it was only a little after 7. Roy sure didn't like hanging about, John mused. Silently, Roy handed the thicker set of files to John and proceeded in the direction of the kitchen. "I'll make a brew while you get started on those," he shouted back over his shoulder. John didn't argue, but entered the front room, fell into the nearest chair, and was quickly engrossed in the files. Roy didn't interrupt once. He just eyed John every now and then. "Well, they're pretty much the same as the recent cases," John conceded at last, slamming them on the table. "People's kids from all walks of life, but were any of them ever found?" "No. They all just vanished off the face of the earth, so to speak. We had a few calls from people saying that they had seen one or other of them in different parts of the country, but nothing ever came of it, so we can't be sure whether it was any of them or not." "So they are all still listed as missing?" "That's the official statement. But in my mind, I have no doubt that they are all dead." John eyed Roy thoughtfully. He noticed it sounded like a press release, devoid of any emotions whatsoever, unlike how head up he had got last night. "And these recent reports of missing kids, is it your opinion that they are dead too?" Roy hesitated a moment before answering, "Yes." "Well, if that is the case, we had better catch this son of a bitch before he kills any more." "You can be sure of that, son." John stared at Roy a moment. There was something in the tone of his voice that troubled him. A thought suddenly hit him, but it didn't seem possible. "Do you," he began slowly, "think that the same person is responsible for these recent events, as well as the past?" He half expected to be laughed at, or even rebuked for such a stupid idea, but instead, Roy simply nodded. "But how could that be? And why wait so long to start killing these kids again, if they are dead?" "I don't know. I've been asking all these questions myself, but I've nothing else to go on." John sensed the desperation in his voice. "Okay, so what do we do?" "Well, I've got a lead. The school janitor seems to be a link between them all. And what's more, he's been at the school for over 30 years now." "Before," John began, "you said you were sure that he was going to kill again. Why?" "I can't really be sure, but 30 years ago there were 13 kids that went missing. 13 that we know for sure were linked. Then it just stopped. So if it is the same person, he could be going for the same number. It might mean something to him." Roy shrugged feebly. "Gee, Roy, no offense, But isn't that a bit of a long shot? It's a hell of a long shot, but I've got to work on that assumption. There are lives involved here. But so far, only 7 have gone missing. If you are right, then he's going after another 6, and we haven't a bloody clue that they're going to be. That's right, Johnny boy. Roy gave a half-hearted wink. So we better get on overtime, that is, if you're in. Oh, I'm in, John snapped, but we could be looking for a woman. We could, Roy replied, his tone making it clear that they weren't. He needed a case that would take his mind off the recent events, even if it was slightly connected. It was a pity about Cindy. He would have liked to get to know her better. But that was the story of his life. If someone he liked came along, he would go and blow it. He hadn't been out with anyone since Carol left him. Although he had tried, he still hadn't forgiven her for that. After all, he wasn't completely to blame. It was his work. He had to work, and yes, the hours were long. But she had known that when she had moved in with him. After all, being a detective wasn't a 9-to-5 job, and it wasn't as shady as she'd tried to make out. In the end, her constant snide remarks and comments had made it so hard for him to face that he would have to have at least 4 pints inside him before he could bear to be in the same room as her. And however shady his job was, he was good at it, so he was surprised when she thought he wouldn't find out about her fancy man. It sure felt good when he broke the guy's jaw, but that stunt just about sealed the fate of their somewhat dodgy relationship. When John and Roy got to the school, they received a frosty reception from the headmaster. He wasn't sure it would be all right to interview the janitor on school grounds and in school time. "Listen, you son of a bitch," Roy spat out into the small, podgy, sweating face of the now not-so-cocky headmaster. "We're investigating the whereabouts of 6 kids who have disappeared. They might even be dead. And so, unless you want us to drag your sorry arse down to the station, I suggest that you give us all the help you can." The little man was shaking all over, Roy's words sinking in deep. Pressing the intercom, he quickly sent for the janitor. When John saw the man enter the room, his first thought was that there was no way that this could be the person they were after. The janitor had a severe limp and only one arm. He was also no bigger than 5 feet tall. But if Roy had any such doubts, he never let it show. He was on the man as soon as he entered the room, spitting questions at him so fast that he had no time to answer any. John felt sorry for the poor wretch standing in front of him, who finally broke down in tears under Roy's unrelenting bombardment. He gripped hold of Roy's arm and whispered in his ear with just enough menace, "That's enough. Do you want a complaint going in before we've even started?" Roy reared round, and his eyes were like blazing black coals. For an instant, John thought he was going to swing for him. Then the madness was gone, and Roy went storming out the door without another word. John managed a hollow smile at the sniveling man before following after him. Roy was waiting outside with a face like thunder. "Don't ever interfere again when I'm questioning a suspect," he raged. John just nodded. He decided that to say anything would only make it worse. But he still didn't think the janitor was their man. And what was more, he had the feeling that Roy didn't believe he was either. It was just that he wanted to nail someone so badly that he was desperately living in hope. It was at this moment that John remembered his trip up to the field and the remains of the fire he had found. He told Roy, and his anger flooded away and was replaced by a newfound urgency. As soon as they were on the other side of the gate, the headaches came back and pounded the back of John's skull. The skies had turned a dull slate gray, and it was only a matter of time before the heavens opened and threw down all it had at them. "It's no far now," John announced, turning to Roy. Was it the light, or was Roy getting younger? As they drew nearer to the spot, John could see a small fire burning. Roy put his finger to his lips, and they moved in closer. There was a figure bent over something, and as they watched, they could see that whatever it was struggling. As they edged nearer, John could see that the struggling creature was a child. Rage welled up in him, and without thinking, he let out an angry snarl and leapt towards the dark figure. But the stranger had heard him and rose to its full height and turned to greet John. And he was suddenly face to face with the killer from his dreams, skins, snakes, skull and all. But he knew that this was no dream, as the thing lifted him off his feet and hurled him against the nearest tree. The impact sent shock waves throughout his entire body, and he slumped to the ground, mist already clouding his eyes. But before the blackness came, he had time to see Roy sneaking up behind the thing, and with a hollow thud, he brought his torch down full onto the nightmare's head, sending the snake's head one way and the figure sprawling across the orange flames of the dying fire. Chapter 8. John felt as though he had been hit by a runaway train. Just about every bone in his body ached, and in places he hadn't known could do. He felt the ground beneath him tremble. He tried to open his eyes, but they felt as though they had been stuck together with super glue. He reached up to rub them, but found that no matter how hard he tried, he was unable to move. Panic flooded through him, and he was relieved to feel his eyelids pop open. At first, he was looking through a very heavily woven net curtain, but as his eyes started to focus, the net curtain slowly dissolved, and he found himself gazing into a pair of bloodshot green eyes. "How you feelin', fella?" the green-eyed ambulance man asked. "Where am I? Where are you taking me?" John inquired, confused. But before the man had a chance to answer, John remembered. He remembered the beast from his dreams. He remembered the child's cries. And he remembered Roy laying the son of a bitch out cold. "How's the child?" he asked, trying to sit up, but feeling the straps biting into his arms. "Don't fret about the child. You should be more concerned about yourself. You took one hell of a blow." It was as though his words were a sign, and a sharp pain shot down John's spine so suddenly that it yanked his head back. And as this happened, his teeth clenched on the fleshy part of his cheek, and he tasted the coppery blood. He must have passed out again, for when he next opened his eyes, he was in a bright white room, and two figures hovered over him. The nurse smiled shyly at him, but the doctor just eyed him coldly and went back to reading the chart he held in his unsteady hands. "I wonder if these guys a surgeon," John mused absently. "Right. It looks as though we'll be having the pleasure of your company for a day or so, Mr. Lou," the doctor rasped, without taking his eyes off the chart. Was that whiskey he could smell? Surely not. "Call me John, all my friends do. You can get some rest now. We'll be doing some tests later, Mr. Lou," the man retorted, making it clear that he had no intention of being one of his friends. "Hey, just a minute. I've got a job to do. I can't just lay about in here," John yelled after the retreating white-clad, scrawny figure. But the doctor didn't seem to hear him and disappeared from sight before John could release another protest. "You best get some rest," the nurse smiled. "Although your back isn't broken, we still have some more tests to do." John was puzzled. "How do you know my back isn't broken?" "We X-rayed you when you were brought in. Now you settle down. I'll be back so old. Red Eyes shot something in me to make me sleep. Isn't that just dandy?" John mused. After the nurse left, he realized that a rest wasn't such a bad idea after all. The pain was beginning to subside a little. but arrest would do no harm. His eyes slowly focused on the swinging overhead light. The room no longer looked white. It was more like a white whipped with a bucket of blood, then smeared across the plaster in large patches. A strange sound caught his attention. It was a sort of scrapping noise, followed by a thud, then a ping. He pulled himself gingerly out of bed, and then cautiously peered round the door. The corridor was empty. He followed the noise until he came to the end of the corridor and reached a set of fire doors. He pushed the doors apart, and the origin of the strange sound was revealed to him. The lift doors were opening and closing, only they didn't close all the way. That was the answer to the thumping sound. A pair of legs was sticking out of the lift, preventing the doors from shutting properly. John reached the lift in a few easy strides. He stared down into the unseeing eyes of the pretty nurse. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind and swirled to see the monster from his nightmares coming towards him, dragging the limp body of the frail doctor by the hair. "I hear you're not feeling so good. You need to see a doctor?" The thing mocked, pulling the worn-out doctor over his head and throwing him at John like some old trash bag. The body landed full force on him, knocking him flat and forcing a loud rasp from his lungs. He suddenly felt suffocated and started beating blindly at the body with his fists. "Take it easy. You're all right. You're all right." His eyes snapped open, and he found himself looking up into the troubled eyes of the young nurse. Another bloody dream. The thing was mocking him, but it was no dream what happened last night, and he had seen Roy laid the thing flat, so Roy must have him. He had to be real, and he couldn't have escaped. It was about time he went and faced his unknown tormentor, but before he could leave, he would be subjected to a complete once-over. Not for his sake, but to protect the hospital if he insisted on leaving, and he insisted. After a few tests and a few needles and prods, he was given the all-clear. The pain in his back had turned into a steady throb, but he could live with that just as long as he got out of the hospital. He had always reasoned that if you stayed in a hospital too long, then you would only get worse. When he walked into the police station, Roy was a bit surprised to see him. He thought that John would be kept in overnight at least. "How you feeling, son?" The concerned cop rushed to help him, as though he was an invalid. "You took one hell of a knock. You caught the son of a bitch, didn't you? Tell me you've still got him," John pleaded. The concern quickly vanished from the granite face and was replaced by a broad smile. "We've still got him." "And the kid? What about the kid?" Everything had happened so fast the previous night that John suddenly realized he didn't know if the child was a girl or a boy. "I'm sorry, John, but there was nothing we could do for him. He'd been dead at least 10 hours before we arrived." Roy's words hung in the air, and John felt his stomach tighten, rage building up inside. Then what the hell was that freak doing up there, torturing a dead body? He hadn't been up there for 10 hours working on the corpse, had he? John gasped. No, the guy's sick, but someone would surely have seen him if he had been there that long. "Do you know who the boy was?" "Yes, his name was on our missing person files." Roy shook his head sadly. "I've just had the task of informing his parents, and that's not a bloody nice job, I can tell you." "I'm sorry, Roy," John murmured, not really knowing what to say. "But we're lucky. This is the first time that we've found a body." "Lucky!" Roy yelled. "Lucky! Tell that to the poor bastard's parents." John watched as the big man circled the room, hitting his palm with his rock-like fist. "I'm sorry, John," he sighed, deflated. "You're right, of course. If we hadn't stumbled onto him when we did, this boy would still be on the missing persons list 30 years from now. This comment wasn't wasted on John. Has he confessed to any of the others? Confessed? He hasn't even confessed to this one, Roy snarled, his voice rising once more. What? John gasped, his voice rising also, unable to believe what he was hearing. We caught him red-handed. We know that, but in this sick fuck's head we didn't. Can I see him? Roy led John down to the cells and stood to one side, pushing the door open. The smell hit him. What's that bloody stink? John spat, covering his nose with the back of his hand. Oh, that's our guest. He has a habit of shitting himself. Roy grinned, not bothering to cover his nose. John walked slowly down the narrow passage, flanked on both sides by cells. He was sniffing his way to the cell he wanted. He stopped outside a heavy door, letting Roy pull the cover back so that he could look inside. At first, all he could see was a hunched figure in the far corner of the small room. Just a bundle of rags. As he watched, the bundle of rags moved and then got slowly to its feet. The first thing that hit John was the man's size. He was about 5'8" at the very most. But the thing from his dreams, and the thing that he had seen last night, was a bloody human tower, at least 6'8". He could be stooping, but there was another difference as well. The man before him wasn't anywhere near as wide either. The rambling figure turned to face him. John gasped. The face that he saw belonged not to a monster, but to a sad, rough old tramp. The tramp looked scared and confused. Why am I here? What you want from me? He pleaded, throwing himself at the door, almost into John's face. John took a step back. What is this? Who is this? He stammered. Roy looked puzzled, and then stared through the hatch, as if making sure. This is the guy we caught last night. No way. John shook his head. This isn't the man I saw. Roy slammed the hatch back in place, and then led John roughly out of the corridor. What the hell are you saying? Have you gone mad? He snarled, kicking the door shut behind with a loud crash. Roy, I saw the guy last night. He was taller, and he was a bloody lot wider, for Christ's sake, John hissed, searching the old cop's face for any sign that this might be some sort of test or something. I don't know what you think you saw, but I saw that guy pick you up and hurl you against a tree. I hit him, for crying out loud. He's got one hell of a gash on his head to prove it, Roy shouted, eyes blazing. Then his face softened, and he placed a gentle hand on John's shoulder. Look, John, I know you're probably a little mixed up still. Maybe you should go home and get some sleep. I'll call round later. Yeah, maybe you're right, John sighed. He was starting to doubt what he had seen. Maybe he was seeing his nightmare in everything that happened. But even so, he found it hard to believe that the tramp in the cell was the same man who had lifted him off his feet and thrown him 10 feet through the air. They did say that madmen had the strength of 10 men, but still. So he's been charged with murder then. Too bloody right, and there's a hearing tomorrow to make sure he ain't to going nowhere. I've got a lot more questions for this arsehole. The look in Roy's eyes made John glad that he wouldn't be anywhere around at the time. Before going home, he called in at the office to see if any new cases had come in, or if there was any call about this old one. Some guy had called by the name of Mitch Stone. He hadn't given a clue what it was about, but he had left a contact number. This might be another case. Maybe I can even get back to normal things like wife watching. John moaned to the answering machine. He dialed the number and waited. After about 10 rings, it was picked up by a cheerful voice on the other end. Hello, Mitch Stone, Daily News. John slammed the phone back down hard. Bloody reporters, he snarled. I guess I'm going to be bugged by them all day. He left the office and headed for home. Not before he had made another tape for the answering machine, though. Hello, I'm John Lowe. Please state your name and business after the tone, unless you're a reporter. Then the second word's off. Take your pick what the first one is. When he reached home, he was in two minds whether to go back and change the tape. It was childish. But hell, he really didn't like reporters. He had had a few bad write-ups by the press when his cases didn't go the way he had planned, and that had happened a few more times than he would have liked. They would come round all nicely to get his side of the story, and then always paint him as a bad guy and just print what they liked. As far as they were concerned, he was a lowlife just like them. After a hot bath, he felt a lot better. The aches had almost gone. Only when he moved quickly was he reminded of his tender back. He poured himself a brandy, and putting on a CD, he fell into the nearest chair. He had only been in the house a day or so without music, and that was a day or so too many. He had found a cheap CD player in a discount store in town, and even found a couple of good CDs, too, to go with the collection he had brought with him. A part of his worldly goods, huh? It was a bit early to drink, and he normally wouldn't at this time, but he felt that he had a right to. He had earned this drink, and the next couple he was going to have after it. As the brandy warmed his body, a welcoming haze dropped across his eyes, and 100 voices started chattering inside his mind. He really was starting to think that the best thing he could do was to pack up and get the hell out of here. He had had this thought before, and always talked himself out of it. But now, well, he wasn't putting up a very good defense for staying. Maybe it was the brandy. He was beginning to reflect that maybe he never really had a case, that maybe Cindy never existed. Maybe she was just another part of his dreaming, that maybe he needed professional help. Maybe he was on the brink of one hell of a breakdown. A lot of maybes, but he had seen Old Man Woods, and he was real, not anymore. Someone had seen fit to kill him, but why? He was just an old man. Maybe he really did know the killer, and John had led him there, led him to where Henry was hiding. Maybe he was responsible for his death. There were those maybes again. John had had more than just another couple of drinks by the time Roy arrived. Seeing the state he was in, Roy just shook his head, declined a drink, and sat opposite just watching him. What? John finally slurred. So I'm pissed. So what? I had a bad night, okay? Yeah, I know, John, so did I. I've had no sleep, but hell, I thought I'd call in and see how you were doing. Oh, I'm doing just dandy. No need to worry about me. You're going to be hounded by the press, Roy began. And if you tell them what you told me, it won't help our case. Oh, don't worry, Roy. You've got your killer, you're sure of that, so that's fine by me. It was dark, like you said. I really couldn't see him. No, if you say he is the guy, then he's our man. John lied. He had seen him all right, but it just wasn't the face the tramp wore. Well, I'm glad about that. Roy sighed, visibly relieved. Let's put this to rest once and for all. Put it to rest? You're not trying to tell me you think he was the same guy 30 years ago? John asked, startled. We don't think, we know. The son of a bitch admitted it. Roy grinned arrogantly. Well, you must feel pretty damn good. You've cracked the case single-handedly, so we can all sleep soundly tonight. John spat sarcastically. Anger and hurt shot across Roy's face, and he got up to leave. I'm sorry, John blurted out, grabbing the old cop's arm. I really am sorry. I've had too much to drink, and I'm not thinking straight. The hard features slowly crumbled. The chiseled chin dropped, and a broad smile spread the entire width of Roy's face. "Don't worry, kid. I understand. But you're forgetting one thing." "What's that?" John asked, puzzled. "I didn't do it single-handedly. I had your help." John was lying in bed, drifting in and out of sleep. He was tormented by the old tramp's face. No matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't picture him as a killer. Not now, and not 30 years ago. Sure, he could have been a killer 30 years ago, but something inside kept telling him that there was no way. Flashbacks kept invading his mind. Cindy being knocked down, the beast torturing the boy, the events from his past, things he had forgotten, his mother and father fighting, and although he could see his mother's face clearly, so clear he could reach out and touch her, he still couldn't see his father's face. All he could see was the huge size of him. Suddenly, a heavy knock on the front door brought him back to reality. All right, I'm coming," John yelled, grabbing his dressing gown and taking the stairs 2 at a time. He threw open the door and was greeted by a broad, smiling face. "Do you know what bloody time it is?" John screamed, not knowing the time himself. "I'm sorry about this, Mr. Liu, but I've been trying to get hold of you for some time," the grin said, getting even wider. John suddenly knew who it was standing on his front step. "Didn't you get the message?" he hissed. I know, the reporter said, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "But please just hear me out." There was something in the man's voice that stopped John from slamming the door into the annoying grin. He still felt groggy from the brandy, but he agreed to hear him out, and then he would throw him out, John mused. "Oh, by the way, I thought of one. How about piss?" Ah, the answering machine. John grinned and led the way to the front room. It was a bit childish, I admit, but, well, you know. "Yeah, I know, all right. We're not the world's most loved people," the reporter grinned. That's an understatement, John thought. And despite himself, he was beginning to warm to the man. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Mitch Stone," the reporter offered an outstretched hand. "I'm John Lowe." They shook hands. "Now what can I do for you that seems so urgent that it can't wait till morning?" "Well, I believe that you were there when Sergeant Jones made the arrest." "Made what arrest?" John asked coyly. "We know that he's got a man for the murder of Lee Phillips, and that he's been charged with molesting the other kids who have gone missing in this area," the reporter said, in a well-rehearsed monotone. "Look, Mitch, you don't mind if I call you Mitch?" The reporter waved his hand. "Well, Mitch, it's like this. I'm not really at liberty to discuss the case," John whispered low, and with meaning. "Besides, you seem to know a lot more about the case than me." Which was true. John hadn't known that the murdered boy's name was Lee Phillips. The press really did have a way of finding things out. "I know you're not supposed to talk about it, but this really is important. Was the man there charging the man you saw?" John heard his breath expel and felt as though he had been hit in the chest with a sledgehammer. Why was this reporter questioning him about the very thing that he'd been asking himself about? "It was dark. I can't be sure," John blurted out without thinking. The reporter looked hard at him for a moment. No more trace of that irritable grin. "Well, I'll take that as a no." "Now, I didn't say that," John yelled, anger rising. "You didn't have to." "Okay, what's this all about?" John sighed. "We need to know whether the man they arrested is really the man who committed the murder." "Why would you doubt that he is the man?" John asked, trading question for question. Mitch stood up and started pacing the room. Finally, he must have reached a decision. If I tell you this, you're not to tell anyone, not anyone, Mitch hissed, giving his words meaning. Hey, you got my word. Well, I got a tip-off that the man they've got isn't the killer. You get these cranks calling all the time, John answered, disappointed that that was all there was to it. This isn't a crank. I know the person, and well, they don't go round making things up, Mitch said in almost a whisper. And they'll state their life that they saw Sergeant Jones drag out an old tramp in the middle of the night, hit him across the back of the head, and dragged him away. Now, is this the man they are charging? John was stunned. He kept wondering if there was more than one witness, by the way Mitch kept saying they. Because if it is, Mitch continued, then this was 3 hours after you were supposed to have arrested him up in the field. Mitch let his words sink in. And another thing, haven't you asked yourself why Sergeant Jones seems to be in charge of this case, and not CID? Chapter 9. John stared hard at the stranger who had invaded his home at such a late hour and thrown his mind into turmoil. He flung himself out of the chair and started to almost march and almost stumble round the room, stopping only occasionally to stare at the reporter, whose eyes were glued on every move he made. But the reporter was making no effort to speak. He was giving John time to chew things over. I'm going to make a drink. Do you want one? John suddenly asked harshly. Yay, that would be fine. A coffee, thanks, the reporter muttered meekly. When John had left the room, Mitch gazed slowly round at the old furnishings. The room felt cold. It didn't feel lived in. Suddenly, he felt an icy chill crawl down his spine. It started from the top and slowly clawed its way down. Mitch could feel the perspiration well up and trickle down his forehead. He felt as though the room was trying to choke him and was about to get up and get the hell out of there when just as suddenly it disappeared, leaving his heart pumping so hard it felt as if it would explode. The door opened, and John re-entered the room, handed Mitch his drink, and flopped into the seat opposite. They sat in silence. Everything was so jumbled up in John's head that he couldn't make any sense of any of it. What was this man sitting in front of him trying to say? That Roy had gone out into the street and picked up some bum, charged him with the whole bunch of kids that had disappeared, and the ones from 30 years ago thrown in for good measure. Shit. He just couldn't swallow it. But if it was true, then what had happened to the nightmare freak that John had seen Roy drop? Look, Mitch began, I know that this cop's a friend of yours, but I can assure you that I'm not mistaken on this. Listen, I'm just not sure I can take any of this seriously. As you've said, he is my friend, and I think it's only fair that I can see some proof of what you say. As John finished his short sermon, he thought, sure, he's my friend, or at least I think he's my friend. But just how well do I know him? The answer was, not well at all. He was just a memory from a long-lost youth, from 1,000,000 years ago. The fact that John had hit it off with him was simple. He needed a friend, and Roy came along at the right time and fitted in nicely as that friend. And although he didn't want to believe what this man was saying about Roy, the truth was, he knew that the man in the cells was not the man from the previous night. And however much he tried to explain this to himself, he just couldn't come up with a good enough answer, except that he was going mad, and he wasn't about to admit to that just yet. Okay, let's say I believe you. What do you want me to do? Stand up and say, hey, that's not the man. That's some poor bum John dragged off the street, and everyone would just believe me. John's voice rose in despair. Wow, take it easy, Mitch cried, holding up his hands. I know that no one's going to believe your word against... Roy's. He was barely able to say the name. He would much have preferred to say, the pigs. But he had to trod carefully so as not to upset John any further. But why wouldn't they believe me? John asked, with mock hurt. So all we can do for now is do nothing. What do you mean, do nothing? Why the hell come round here if all you wanted was to do nothing? John gasped. I know, but as you pointed out, it's your word against his, and he would come up with at least a dozen reasons why you're no good as a witness. So you've got to play along with him and watch what he's up to. There was a pregnant pause before John asked, So, what about the bum in the cells? Are we just going to let him go down for this while the killer's still out there? That's just what we're going to do. Mitch noticed the startled expression on John's face. I know, I sound bloody heartless, but as you said, the killer's still out there, and our friend Roy knows more than he's letting on. I suppose you're right, John admitted, defeated. But we'll have to be careful, so as not to alert him. If there's one thing he's not, that's stupid. Mitch left his home number in case John needed to reach him out of office hours, and bade him good night, leaving John with 101 things crashing through his mind. After a restless night, John was woken by a heavy thumping on the door. He had lain there for a good 5 minutes without realizing what it was. He threw on his dressing gown and almost tumbled down the stairs. He opened the door, and the cold morning air washed through him, sending a shudder down his spine. Ah, so you are still in the land of the living, Roy chuckled, stepping into the hallway without waiting to be invited. Only just, John replied, rubbing the cobwebs from his eyes. I think you sank a few too many last night, boys. You don't have to tell me that. I've got a constant reminder hammering away at the back of my skull, John mumbled, sulkily, leading the way into the front room. So what you got planned for today, Roy? Well, I thought we would go back up to the field and take a real good look around. See if there is any small thing that doesn't look right. Okay, you got it, John said eagerly. He was glad of the chance to go back up to the field. He knew that the answer lay up there somewhere, and he was going to find it if it was the last thing he did. Also, he wanted to see how Roy acted up there, and he would be able to befriend him again and try and regain his confidence. It was just getting light when they reached the gate. John found himself slowing down the closer they came to it. Roy was the first over the gate, and as he landed, he was almost trotting along. As John watched, he seemed to fade, and the mist swirled up and swallowed him. His stomach churned, but he vaulted the gate and landed on the wet grass on the other side. The familiar sick feeling hit him at once, but he ignored it, and in a few long strides, he was beside the cop. What do you think we'll find up here? Well, boy, I'm not rightly sure what we'll find, but I have a feeling that something's, yay, you and me both, John thought. And as he studied the old cop's face, he started to doubt that he could have anything to do with this nightmare. As John watched, Roy strolled over to a clearing in the trees and began to scratch at the surface with his foot. Hey, I think I've found something, Roy exclaimed. John couldn't believe it. They had only been in the field a few minutes, and here they were, already stumbling onto something. If he had any doubts about Roy before, they had completely gone now. Did he really come across as that stupid? Roy hadn't even put any heart into the little show of his. And what he didn't realize, or care about, was that he had already searched this area with a fine tooth comb and came up empty-handed. What is it? John asked, trying to put as much enthusiasm into his voice as he could. This earth's been dug up recently. Someone's tried to hide the fact, but I can tell. What do you think we should do?" John asked what he knew Roy wanted him to ask. May as well play his little game. "Well, I'm tempted to get a shovel and see what's down there, but I think it would be best if we called it in." John couldn't help but notice the WEE part, so here he was, ready to back up Roy's tale again. If Mitch hadn't told him his story, John might have thought that Roy was just one hell of a cop, but now that he knew, even Columbo couldn't have got this far so quick. As these thoughts entered his head, he suddenly felt a rolling sensation in the pit of his stomach. He was a good 10 yards in front of Roy. He couldn't wait to get out of the field. He didn't know why he was always ill when he visited the place, but he knew that the longer he spent in it, the worse he felt. And he also knew that the longer he spent in it, the more explicit the nightmares were that always followed. "Hey, hang on there, boy. I'm not as fit as I used to be." "Sorry, but I want to get this call in," John lied. "I know, but we don't want to have a heart attack into the bargain," Roy laughed. John was wondering just what was under that loose earth. An idea kept springing to mind, but he quickly pushed it as far back as he could. He didn't even want to accept that possibility. But if it did come true, then Roy was into this shit right up to his head and over, and John would make sure that he was there to see him buried. John made a drink while Roy called in his report and requested some men with shovels. By the sound of his voice, he was having a tough time convincing his bosses about the need to dig up a piece of ground on what he could best describe as a hunch. "If I'm wrong on this, you can have my badge," he snarled, slamming down the receiver. John had to do his best to keep from laughing. That line was just a little too much. While they were waiting for the team to arrive, they made a bit of small talk, but neither of them mentioned what might be under the disturbed earth. Under the circumstances, anyone else would be excited by the find and having all kinds of wild ideas on what might be there. But Roy was keeping tight-lipped. It was as if he wasn't bothered. John was sure he was going through this charade, partly for his benefit and partly for the investigation. They both heard the car drawing up and were out the door before it had time to come to a halt. Upon seeing them, Roy was a completely different man. He had suddenly taken on an air of urgency. He was ordering the men around with a surge of excitement. And his surge of excitement had rubbed off on them. They couldn't wait to get the tools out of the van and get into the field. John stood back and watched all this. He felt as though he had a first-class ticket and was the only one who had turned up for the show. It seemed the more he was around Roy, the more he had to learn. He didn't know if Roy was a good cop, but he now realized he was one hell of an actor. "Come on, John, let's show them where it is," Roy yelled, his fake enthusiasm bubbling over, making John cringe. Reluctantly, he fell in behind the circus. Once back up in the trees, Roy never faltered. He went straight over to the spot without hesitation. The eager men went right to work. John could tell by the speed they were going that they weren't policemen. They were local laborers who were being paid a set price for the job, no matter how long it took, and they were out to make sure that it didn't take too long. As John watched, his belly did 1,000 cartwheels, and his head started to thump. It felt as though hounded voices were all screaming to be heard at once. "What's the matter, boy?" Roy asked, taking a few easy strides to his side. "You sure look pale. I wish he would cut that boy crap." "I don't feel too good, I'm sorry. I think I'll go back to the house." "Okay then. I'll be in touch as soon as we find something." Again, John noticed the "as soon as we find something," not "if we find something." He was also surprised that Roy hadn't made a fuss and insisted that he stayed. But then again, he had served his purpose. John practically ran back down the field. His head felt like it would explode at any minute, and he could taste the bile rising in his throat. He hadn't realized just how far he had run until he fell headlong into the gate. Resting against the rough timber, he tried to gather the strength to climb it. Suddenly, his mind was raped by 100 voices, all demanding him to come back. And now John had all the strength he needed. It was as though the gate didn't exist. Falling flat on his backside, he was up in an instant, and without a backwards glance, he ran over to the house, fumbled with his key, hit the latch, and fell inside, kicking the door shut behind trying to cut out the voices. But the voices would not be shut out. He couldn't tell what they were trying to say, but they sounded tortured and twisted beyond anything he could imagine. He sank slowly to the floor and felt hot rivers flowing from his eyes. He didn't know why he was crying, but he knew that he must. He knew that he was crying for all those tortured souls. And he knew that the tortured souls were the victims of his nightmare. And somehow, he had to do something to put those souls to rest. And he was crying because he knew that he had no idea what it was he had to do. He didn't know how long he had been crouched behind the door, nor did he know when the voices subsided. He felt helpless and used and needed a friend more than anything. But he had no friends, no one he could just call up and talk to. And he had no love in his life, something that he suddenly missed, something that he knew would go a long way in helping him get through this thing. He had hoped that Cindy was going to be a piece of his life, but now he wasn't even sure if there ever had been a Cindy. He decided to call the only person whom he could think came anywhere near a friend, and that was a hell of a long way away. After the 1,000th dial tone, John was about to replace the receiver when a breathless voice answered, "Hello, Mitch Stone speaking." "You sound a bit knackered," John said easily, as though he was speaking to a lifelong pal. "Hi, John. I was just leaving when I heard the phone ring." "Well, the reason I'm calling is, you found something?" "Well, I don't know for sure." John relayed his story to Mitch, leaving nothing out, not even his thoughts on the matter. "I'll be right over. Stay put." John felt as though he had taken one step forward by just calling Mitch. He didn't know how Roy would react when he found out. On one hand, he might regard it as another notch to back up his story and be glad the press was up there. He wouldn't get any grief because he hadn't called them. But on the other hand, he might feel betrayed by John, and what little trust he might have in him would surely go right out the window. So John didn't know how Roy was going to take it, but whichever way, it was too bloody late now. Roy eyed the two figures approaching. He knew one was John, but who the hell was the other guy? "Hi, Roy. Found anything?" "You feeling better, boy?" he replied, looking straight past John. His eyes locked on. "Yay, a bit," John said, noticing the hostile look. "This is a friend of mine, Mitch Stone." Roy made no attempt to shake the outstretched hand. "What the hell's he doing up here?" Roy hissed, now completely ignoring Mitch. "I thought he might be useful. You see he's a reporter." The anger that suddenly filled Roy's face was so frightening that John took a couple of uneasy steps backwards. Roy followed John's retreat, fists clenched, and his hot breath filling John's nostrils with a sour odor. "And what the hell use is a fucking reporter?" Roy's voice spat venom. "I thought that it would back us up having a reporter on the spot when we find something to strengthen our case against that asshole we got locked up. It might not prove anything against him. I know, but I'm sure we might be able to swing it against him." Roy's face suddenly lit up, and a heavy wave of laughter ripped from him. "Boy, I guess you got detective skills from me," he roared, slapping John's back, almost knocking the wind from him. "We found something!" one of the workmen yelled from the ever-growing hole. They quickly rushed over to the hole and watched as the workman scraped away with a pointing trowel at something white. John knew what the white thing was straight away and watched in slow motion as the object became a finger and then a hand, and then the hand grew an arm as the digger prodded the earth away. John could feel the voices in the back of his head cry out. He was suddenly aware of Mitch dancing round the pit, taking pictures from every possible angle. Funny, he couldn't remember seeing Mitch with a camera. His eyes started to go in and out of focus, and he felt his knees weakening. A voice from behind was congratulating Roy on a good job, and he felt Roy's hand fall on his shoulder like a lead weight. "Well, I had a lot of help from this guy," Roy was saying. John's eyes were transfixed by the hole and the white figure taking shape. Suddenly, as though giving birth, the earth opened up and a gleaming skull broke forth. There was a sudden loud scream in the back of his mind, and his legs buckled, and he fell face first into the freshly dug earth. As his stomach lost control, the darkness came to claim him. Chapter 10. "Hey, are you all right, bud?" The words filtered through the thick haze like a distant chant. "Come on, you're doing fine." The words seemed to be coming from much closer now. He felt a slap and a slight stinging sensation on his cheek, and slowly opened his eyes to be confronted by a white blur. As his eyes adjusted, the white blur became a concerned face. "You gave me quite a turn then," Mitch beamed. John remembered what had caused this blackout. He looked over to the trench and saw two men in white coats closing a large black plastic bag. Turning his head, he saw at least half a dozen more plastic bags being placed into the back of a van. "How long have I been out?" he asked, climbing unsteadily to his feet. "Almost 40 minutes now." "Bloody hell, that long," John gasped. "I know, mate. That is a long time. Much too long for an average blackout," Mitch said, reading his thoughts. "I wanted to call an ambulance, but I wouldn't let him," Roy broke in. "I know you're prone to these attacks." John eyed him sharply. "I bet you do," he thought. "I don't feel so good. I think I'll go back to the house," John said, swaying visibly. "I'll come with you," Mitch jumped in. "That's if it's okay with you," he added, turning to Roy. "It's okay. We're just about done here." As they turned to walk away, Roy shouted, "Hey, kid." They both turned to look at the big, grinning red face. "Don't print anything until I give the word." Then he put a smug thumb up. John knew that Roy thought he had done Mitch a big favor by letting him have the exclusive on the story. It wasn't every day that a small hick reporter got such a big scoop. And by the sheepish look on Mitch's face, he knew it. "Hey, look, mate," he declared to John. "I know I've got a hell of a scoop, but I didn't latch on to you just for a story. I want to find the truth behind all these missing kids, too. Relax, relax. I know you're not using me. If I thought you were, you would be flat on your back by now." John laughed, throwing a playful punch. "You look a lot better than you did a few minutes ago," Mitch observed. They had reached the gate by this time, and John knew that he would be 100% better as soon as they were on the other side of it. To tell the truth, the swaying back there was just an act. I just had to get away. John winked. A bright ray of sunlight shone through the window, denying the fact that it was late November, and it was bloody cold outside. They had been sitting in John's front room for over 10 minutes, and neither of them had said a word. John finally broke the silence. "How many remains did they find in the trench?" Mitch was startled by the sudden blunt question. What? How many children were there? John repeated. But they weren't children. They were just bones. Bones that had once had faces, that had once walked, talked, laughed, and cried. That had once had a life, until some sick bastard had taken it from them. They're not sure yet. They were in a right mess, but they reckon it's around 12 to 13. Were they all children? John asked, knowing the answer, feeling his muscles tighten. It's almost certain, Mitch whispered. John slumped back in his chair and rubbed his temples with his thumb and index finger. He let out a heavy sigh and shook his head slightly. I think we both know now for sure that Roy's in this thing up to his neck, Mitch stated. Yep. My guess is that they will trace the bones back to the kids who went missing 30 years ago. They certainly looked as though they had been in the ground that long. No, not in that ground, John spat the words out. But I don't understand it, Mitch mused. Why would Roy take the remains from wherever they have been for the last 30 years and suddenly bury them up there and then make out he had found them? It is one hell of a risk, but I think he really wants to lynch the poor bum he's got stashed in the cells and put this thing to rest. He's trying to say he's the murderer of Lee Phillips, but he hasn't got any way of linking him with the other kids. And as for these ones from all of those years ago, there's just no way. John regarded Mitch. For a reporter, he sure was slow. What he's trying to do, trying to make people believe, is that he got the location to dig from the bum, that the bum has finally come clean, confessed his sins, couldn't live with the knowledge any longer, and was now prepared to die with a clean slate. I realize this, Mitch said steadily, but how is he going to explain that the bum suddenly admitted to all the killings 30 years ago, admitted to killing Lee Phillips, and I assume the other kids who have gone missing, but hasn't told him where he has hid the other bodies? Mitch realized that he too was calling the old tramp a bum, and mentally scolded himself. John sat up, not so slow after all. That was one hell of a point to which he wasn't sure of the right answer. Well, Mitch, your guess is as good as mine. But maybe he's hoping that the way the public spirit goes, they won't see that. That they will be just glad to get the murderer and overlook the fact that he's not the real killer. They sat in silence again, both trying to work out what was on Roy's mind. One thing was clear, that he knew about the killings 30 years ago, and he sure as hell knew about the kids who have gone missing recently. Both Mitch and John were certain that the kids were all dead. There was no chance that they had just gone missing, run away from home, and would turn up safe. John's heart went out to all the poor parents who were sitting at home by the phone, hoping, praying. He wanted to get Roy now, and he wanted it bad. We've got to do something, he rasped, breaking the silence. Just because he's pinning all this shit on that bum doesn't mean he's going to give up kidnapping and killing children. So you're sure that it really is him that's doing it? That he's not helping or covering up for someone? Yay, I'm sure it's him, John snapped. But he wasn't sure. In fact, he knew that Roy wasn't in this thing by himself. But how the hell could he say? Oh, he's got help. It's a brick shithouse from my dreams. He's the one I really saw killing the kid up in the field, not the bum. But he doesn't really exist. He's just a nightmare. And while we're at it, I think he's got a pal called Cindy, and they're playing some sort of game with me, shit. Who knows? Maybe you're a bloody dream too. What? What was that, John? He suddenly realized that he had spoken the last words out loud, and Mitch was staring at him, puzzled. Sorry, I was just thinking out loud. Oh, right. Just how much do you know about Roy? Mitch said, dismissing John's sudden outburst Well, not a real lot. I remember he was a friend of my aunt's. Now I think about it, they were probably lovers. John told Mitch about her recent death and why he had come back to Buckley. Once he had started, he wished he could keep on going and tell Mitch about the dreams, the strange feelings he got when he entered the field, and just about everything else that had happened in his life. But he knew he couldn't, at least not now. When you went through your aunt's things, did you find anything that might help? Like what? I don't know anything? Mitch didn't know what, but maybe any little thing might give them a clue. I haven't really found anything of hers. When I arrived here, Roy had already dealt with most of the legal stuff. I was glad of it, to be honest. What? Are you telling me you never found anything in the attic? The attic? I haven't been up there. You haven't been up in the attic? Mitch repeated, in mock disbelief. There's always good treasure to be found in the attics of these old buildings. John knew when he had cleaned the house out, when he had first arrived, and found nothing, no personal effects of his aunt, or his parents, or anything that would indicate that any of his family had ever lived in the building, that there would be a good chance of things up in the attic that would throw a light on the past. He got slowly to his feet and stood swaying to and fro, as if he had just taken one giant step for mankind. Mitch sensed his reluctance to move. What is it? You look as though you expect to find some attic-dwelling, blood-sucking, horned and tailed monster. John let out a short, forced laugh. Maybe you're not that far wrong, he muttered, feeling a flock of butterflies doing the tango in the pit of his stomach. It's just that I haven't been up there for 30 years. I used to hide up there as a kid, and well, you know. He let the sentence slide, suddenly feeling stupid. I know, mate. Ghosts in the closet and all that. If you want me to wait down here, I don't mind. Mitch lied. He did bloody mind, after the feeling he had had before, and he didn't want to spend any time alone in this bloody house. No, I would feel better with you there, John said, to Mitch's relief. I don't know what we're going to find up there, but it'll probably mean just as much to you as it would to me. As I've said, I've been away a long time, and I don't remember a lot. But John could recall a great deal more than he was letting on. After a quick rummage round in the shed, they came out with a pair of really old wooden stepladders. John didn't like the look of the rotten things, so he was weighing up the idea of letting Mitch go first. But by the time they reached the top of the stairs, he had decided that he would be the one to go first. The hatch to the attic was just off to the right as they reached the landing, and before John had time to think, Mitch had set the ladders up, climbed up, and removed the cover. He made no attempt to look inside. Instead, he climbed back down, held the bottom rung with his foot, and leaned to one side to let John pass. I've just thought of something, John chirped. We haven't got a bloody torch. There might be a switch in the attic, Mitch said. Give it a try. If not, I've got a torch in the car. John nodded, went quickly up the ladder, and stuck his head through the gaping hole. He waited a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dark, and then he slowly glanced round at the shadows at the far end. As he watched, they seemed to dance towards him, but he knew that it was just a trick of his imagination. He noticed a switch to his left, and was surprised when the attic lit up as he flicked it, giving out a dull yellow glow. He hadn't noticed the smell when he first stuck his head into the loft space, but now it washed completely over him, filling every pore in his body and sending a sickly feeling cascading to his head. He took a deep breath and struggled to keep the bile down. Everything all right? a small voice asked from the foot of the ladder. Yea, I'm just getting used to the stink. But the old decaying stench of rot and damp was one that you just couldn't get used to. Slowly, John grabbed the sides of the hatch and threw himself into the next world. Suddenly, childhood memories came crashing back to him. He remembered how he used to climb up into this strange world when his mom and dad argued, something that now he thought about it happened regularly. He recalled the games he would play in his own private universe. In a kingdom that didn't have any grown-ups, no one to hit him for no reason, no one to yell at him until he burst into tears, and then got the belt for being a sissy. He clenched his teeth as this memory came flooding in. He could almost feel the lashes once more and hear the awful, whooshing sound it made as it tore through the air. John glanced round the boarded floor. The dust was at least an inch deep. Nobody had been in his world for a long time, maybe, he thought. Nobody had been up here since him. But he knew that that wasn't so. Shivers suddenly shot down his back, and he felt an icy chill blow across his face. A voice calling his name filled him with a sudden panic. He swung round and saw a white face staring at him just over the rafters. "Do you mind if I join you?" Mitch almost pleaded. "No, come on up," John replied in an awful imitation of Leslie Crowther. He heard a groan as Mitch clambered in. He wasn't sure if it was a groan from exertion or a response to his crappy impersonation. "Well, there sure is a lot of stuff up here," Mitch gasped. John thought that what he meant to say was a whole lot of crap, and he agreed. A lot of the things he could remember, like the tatty old three-wheeler bike slung in the far corner like some relic of a time gone past. It had always been tatty, even when he had first got it. He also recalled the stick he had to take when he went out on it. All the other kids his age had proper two-wheelers. But he hadn't cared. To him, his was a World War II tank, and he could blow their shitty little bikes into Kingdom Come if he had wanted to. He remembered the day he had confided his plan to the local bully. He couldn't recall why he had told him, maybe to impress him. Well, he wasn't impressed. In fact, he thought he was a nerd, whom he kept repeating as he beat him black and blue. He must have been a nerd to trust a bully. When he got home that night, he got another beating. His father wouldn't stop until he had given him the bully's name. And now that he thought about it, he remembered that he never saw that bully again. Cluttered round the attic stood an assortment of junk. There was an old lampstand, a rocking horse. John hadn't a clue as to where it had come from. He certainly couldn't remember it, and he couldn't for the life of him think why his aunt would have bought it. Right at the back of the attic, shoved deep inside the shadows, he could make out a couple of beaten suitcases, and just to the left, a pile of newspapers, and sticking out from beneath the newspapers, a wooden plaque. "There might be something in them," Mitch whispered. "I reckon so," John agreed. But then he noticed that Mitch didn't mean the suitcases. He was making his way over to the opposite corner. John could see a stack of old biscuit tins of various sizes. He turned back to the wooden plaque and eased it out from beneath the yellowing dead papers. He turned it and read the name aloud. Kukulkan. Kukulkan. He didn't know why, but the very sound of it sent shivers down his spine. But at the same time, the feel of the nameplate felt good in his hand, and the image of it hanging proudly by the front door kept flashing through his mind. He turned round and watched as Mitch opened the top tin and spilled its contents out onto the dust-strewn floor, sending up little pillows of minute particles. John, meanwhile, opened the nearest case and peered inside. It was full with what at first glance he took to be old rags, but on further inspection, he found was clothing, children's clothing. He tried to recall any of it, but couldn't. He couldn't remember any of it being his. He opened another case, and this too was filled with clothing. This time, he was certain that it hadn't belonged to him. It was full of colorful garments, girls' garments. The two remaining cases held the same sort of things. Maybe his aunt had saved them for Oxfam or some other charity. They could even have been her old cloths from her youth. But even as this thought entered John's head, he knew it was bullshit. He picked up one of the yellow-paged newspapers and noticed that it was dated 1960. And the headline stated that another child had gone missing in the Buckley area. There was a photo of an innocent, smiling girl of about 8 years of age. At the foot of the page, the story ended with a statement. The police hadn't any clues. John read the rest, and them all told the same story. Yet another child missing. 12 in all. John was disturbed from his thoughts by Mitch calling him over. "What you got?" he asked, sliding down beside him. "I might have found something. This photo's got Roy in it. It's old, and there's 3 other people in it. Maybe you can help with who they are." Mitch noticed the wooden object in John's hand. "What's that?" John suddenly looked down at his hand, as if noticing the piece of wood for the first time. "Oh, it's an old house nameplate." He held it up for Mitch to inspect. "Was that what this house was called?" "I seem to remember it hanging by the front door." John noticed the look on Mitch's face. "Why, what's the matter?" "Nothing really. It's just a strange name to call a house." "Well, personally I haven't a clue what it means, but I kind of like it. Kukulkan was an ancient Mayan god. You know, from Mexico, he was always represented by a snake or serpent's head." Another chill crept down John's spine. He took the photo from Mitch and studied it. There were 2 couples in it. One was Roy and his aunt. There was no mistake there. And the other couple were his parents, his mother's smiling face, and the bull-like form of his father. But unlike in his dreams, where he couldn't see his father's face, he could see it quite clearly now. And the smiling face set on the tree-trunk neck of his father was also the face that glared out from beneath the snake's head, the face that belonged to the monster in his nightmares.